There once existed a kingdom famous for its golden beer, its sparkling crystal glass, and music that touched the soul. This was Bohemia, a land of rolling hills, ancient forests, and a river that wound through one of the most beautiful cities ever built. For nearly 1,000 years, Bohemia stood as a kingdom of remarkable culture, fierce independence, and profound influence on European history. Its people gave the world some of the finest composers, the most skilled glassmakers, and a spirit of religious reform that changed Christianity forever. This is the complete story of the Kingdom of Bohemia. Let us begin our journey by understanding the land itself. Because before there were kings and castles, before there were great cathedrals and universities, there was simply the land. And what a remarkable land it was. Picture a vast basin, almost perfectly enclosed by mountains on nearly every side. To the north and northeast, the Sudeten Mountains rise like ancient guardians. To the southwest, the Bohemian forest creates a natural wall of endless green. To the southeast, the Bohemian Moravian highlands roll gently toward the neighbouring lands of Moravia. This basin, this natural fortress of geography, would become the heartland of a great kingdom. Through this basin flows the Vltava River, winding its way northward before joining the Elbe, which then carries its waters all the way to the distant North Sea. The Vltava would become the lifeblood of Bohemia, nurturing the growth of settlements along its banks and eventually giving rise to one of Europe's most magnificent cities. The climate here is temperate and kind. Warm summers allow for abundant agriculture. Cold winters, while harsh, are not unbearable. The soil is fertile in the river valleys, and the forests teem with game. The mountains contain silver, tin, and other precious metals that would later bring enormous wealth. In short, this land was blessed with everything a civilization would need to flourish. But who were the first people to call this land home? The answer takes us back thousands of years, long before written records, to the misty ages of prehistory. The earliest inhabitants we know by name were a Celtic people called the Boii. They arrived in this region sometime around the 4th century, before the Common Era, part of the great Celtic expansion across Europe. These Boii were skilled metalworkers and fierce warriors. They built hilltop fortifications called oppida, which served as centres of trade and defence. They farmed the fertile valleys and traded with peoples as far away as the Mediterranean. The very name Bohemia comes from these Celtic Boi. The Romans called this land Boiohaimum, meaning the home of the boy. Even though the Boi themselves would eventually leave or be absorbed by later peoples, their name remained attached to the land forever. It is a beautiful reminder of how the echoes of ancient peoples can persist through the centuries. The Boii faced pressure from Germanic tribes pushing in from the north and east. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the Celtic presence in Bohemia had faded. Germanic peoples, particularly the Marcomanni, took their place. These Germanic tribes would themselves come and go over the following centuries, part of the great migrations that reshaped Europe during the decline of the Roman Empire. Then, sometime in the 6th century, a new people arrived. They came from the east, part of the great Slavic migration that would populate much of Central and Eastern Europe. These were the ancestors of the Czech people, and they would make Bohemia their permanent home. The Slavic settlers found a land that suited them well. They established villages along the rivers and in the fertile valleys. They cleared forests for farmland and raised cattle, pigs and sheep. They were skilled craftspeople, creating pottery, textiles and metalwork. They organised themselves into tribes, each led by a chieftain, and they built fortified settlements called hradišti to protect their communities. Among these early Slavic tribes, several would become particularly important. The Czechs settled in the central part of the basin, around the area that would become Prague. The Zlichans occupied the eastern regions. The Luchans lived in the northwest. Other tribes, like the Daudlebs and the Charvats, settled in the south. For several centuries, these tribes lived side by side, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but gradually developing a shared sense of identity. The early Slavic settlers brought with them their own spiritual traditions. They worshipped a pantheon of gods connected to nature and the forces of the world around them. Perun, the god of thunder and lightning, was among the most powerful. Veles, god of the underworld and cattle, was another important figure. Marana represented winter and death, while various spirits inhabited the forests, rivers, and fields. Sacred groves served as places of worship, and rituals marked the turning of the seasons. These were not primitive people, despite what later Christian chroniclers might have suggested. They had sophisticated agricultural techniques, complex social structures, and rich oral traditions. They simply lived according to a different understanding of the world, one that saw the divine in nature itself. Now let us speak of legends. For the early history of Bohemia is wrapped in legendary tales that, while not strictly historical, tell us much about how the Czech people understood their own origins. The most famous of these legends concerns a man named Czech. According to the old stories, Czech was a leader who brought his people to Bohemia from somewhere in the east. Perhaps they were fleeing conflict, or perhaps they were simply seeking a better land. Whatever the reason, Czech led his tribe on a long journey until they reached a mountain in central Bohemia. This mountain is called Žíp, and it still stands today, rising gently from the surrounding plain. According to the legend, Czech climbed to the summit of Žíp and looked out over the land spread before him. He saw the fertile valleys, the winding rivers, the forests full of game, and he knew that this was the place. He turned to his people and declared that they had found their new home. The land would be called after him, and his people would be known as Czechs. Whether Czech was a real historical figure or a legendary ancestor created to explain the origins of the Czech people, we cannot say for certain. But the story captures something true about the Czech relationship with their land. Bohemia was not simply a place where they happened to live. It was a homeland, chosen and claimed, loved with a fierce devotion that would persist through centuries of foreign rule and attempted domination. A related legend tells of Czech's brother Lech, who continued travelling and eventually founded the Polish nation. Another brother, Rus, went even further east to found Russia. These tales of three brothers creating three great Slavic nations are certainly mythological rather than historical, but they reflect the real kinship among the Slavic peoples and their shared origins in the great migrations of the early medieval period. Another crucial legend concerns a woman named Libuš. She was said to be a daughter of Krok, a wise judge and leader among the early Czechs. Libuš inherited her father's wisdom and his position of leadership. She was a prophetess, gifted with the ability to see the future, and she ruled her people with justice and insight. But some men among the Czechs grew restless under the rule of a woman. They demanded that Libuša take a husband who could lead them in the manner they expected. Rather than resist, Libuša used her prophetic gifts. She told the people to follow her white horse, and wherever it stopped, they would find a man ploughing a field. This man would become her husband and the founder of a great dynasty. The horse led them to a village called Stadis, where they found a young farmer named Přemysl working his field. He was strong, wise, and humble. Libuš married him, and together they founded the Přemyslid dynasty, which would rule Bohemia for over 400 years. But Libuš's most famous prophecy concerned a city. Standing on a cliff above the Vltava river, she gazed into the future and spoke these words: "I see a great city whose glory will touch the stars." She instructed her people to build a castle at the place where a man was constructing a threshold for a house. The Czech word for threshold is pra, and so the castle and the city that grew around it would be called Praha. In English, we know it as Prague. Again, we cannot know how much of this legend is historical truth and how much is poetic invention. But the Přemyslid dynasty was very real, and they did indeed rule Bohemia for centuries. Prague did become one of Europe's greatest cities, and the legends of Libuše and Přemysl provided the dynasty with a sense of legitimacy and destiny that served them well through generations of rule. The early Přemyslids were not yet kings. They were dukes, ruling over a collection of tribes that were gradually coalescing into a single people. The process of unification was slow and sometimes violent. Rival clans had to be subdued or brought into alliance. The Slavnik dynasty, who controlled eastern Bohemia from their stronghold at Liberty, were particularly powerful rivals until they were massacred by the Přemyslids in 995. But before we reach that dark chapter, we must speak of the event that would transform Bohemia more than any other in its early history. We must speak of the coming of Christianity. Christianity had been spreading across Europe for centuries, and by the 9th century it had reached the Slavic lands. The great missionaries Cyril and Methodius, who created the first Slavic alphabet and translated religious texts into a language the Slavic peoples could understand, worked primarily in Moravia, Bohemia's neighbour to the east. Their influence extended into Bohemia as well. But the decisive moment came with Duke Bořivoj, who ruled in the late 9th century. Bořivoj was baptized as a Christian, probably around the year 883, at the court of the Moravian ruler Svatopluk. He was the first historically documented Přemyslid ruler, and his conversion marked the beginning of Bohemia's transformation into a Christian land. Bořivoj's conversion was not simply a personal spiritual choice. It was a political act with enormous consequences. Christianity connected Bohemia to the wider European world. It brought literacy, as monks and priests established schools and scriptoria where books were copied and knowledge preserved. It brought new forms of art and architecture. It brought a new understanding of kingship, in which rulers derived their authority from God and were responsible for the spiritual welfare of their people. But the old ways did not disappear overnight. Many Czechs clung to their traditional beliefs. The conversion of Bohemia was a process that took generations, with Christianity gradually spreading from the ruling elite to the common people. Pagan practices persisted in rural areas for centuries, sometimes blending with Christian traditions in fascinating ways. Bořivoj built the first Christian church in Bohemia at his stronghold of Levi Hradec. It was a modest wooden structure, but it represented something revolutionary. He later moved his seat of power to Prague, building a castle on the hill that would become known as Hradčany. A church dedicated to the Virgin Mary rose within its walls. Prague was beginning its long journey toward becoming one of Europe's great cities. Bořivoj's wife was a woman named Ludmila, and she would become one of the most important figures in early Czech Christianity. Ludmila embraced the new faith with fervour and devoted herself to spreading it among her people. She was particularly influential in the religious education of her grandson, a boy who would become one of Bohemia's most beloved figures. That boy's name was Václav, and in English we know him as Wenceslas. Yes, the same good King Wenceslas celebrated in the famous Christmas carol. But his story, and the story of his grandmother Ludmila, deserves its own chapter. For now, let us simply note that by the end of the 9th century, Bohemia had taken its first steps into the Christian world that would shape its destiny for the next 1,000 years. The land that had once been home to Celtic Boii, then Germanic Marcomanni, was now firmly in the hands of the Slavic Czechs. They had their legends of origin, their founding dynasty, and their new Christian faith. the stage was set for the rise of a kingdom. The story of the Přemyslid dynasty is a story of ambition, faith, violence, and ultimately, the creation of a kingdom that would endure for centuries. It begins with legends, as we have seen, but it continues with very real historical figures whose lives shaped the destiny of Bohemia. We have already met Duke Bořivoj, the first Christian ruler, and his wife Ludmila. After Bořivoj's death around 889, power passed through various hands before reaching his son Vratislav, who ruled until around 921. Vratislav married a woman named Drahomira, who came from a Slavic tribe called the Stodorans. Together, they had two sons who would become central figures in Czech history and legend. The elder was named Václav. The younger was named Boleslav. Ludmila, the grandmother, took a special interest in young Václav's education. She raised him in the Christian faith, teaching him to read and introducing him to the scriptures. Václav grew into a pious, learned young man with a deep commitment to Christianity and a gentle, merciful nature. These qualities would make him beloved by later generations, but they would also put him at odds with those who preferred a more aggressive approach to leadership. When Vratislav died, Václav was still a teenager, too young to rule on his own. His mother Drahomira served as regent, and a power struggle developed between her and Ludmila. The conflict was partly personal, the tension between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but it was also political and religious. Drahomira was less committed to Christianity than Ludmila, and she represented a faction that wanted to limit the influence of the church. In 921, the conflict reached a tragic climax. Men loyal to Drahomira attacked Ludmila at her residence in Tetin and strangled her with her own veil. She became the first Czech martyr and saint, remembered for her devotion to the faith and her role in nurturing the young Václav's Christian education. Václav eventually came of age and assumed power as Duke of Bohemia. His rule was marked by a sincere commitment to Christian principles. He built churches, supported the clergy, and showed mercy to his enemies. He was known for his personal piety, reportedly grinding wheat and pressing grapes with his own hands to make the bread and wine for the Eucharist. But Václav's peaceful nature created problems in the violent world of early medieval politics. Bohemia was surrounded by powerful neighbours, including the growing German kingdom to the west. Václav chose to maintain peace with the Germans, even accepting a subordinate position and paying tribute. This pragmatic approach avoided destructive wars, but it angered those who saw it as weakness and submission. Chief among the discontented was Václav's own brother, Boleslav. Where Václav was gentle and pious, Boleslav was ambitious and ruthless. He gathered supporters who shared his dissatisfaction with Václav's policies. And on September 28th, 935, or possibly 929, the exact year is disputed, Boleslav made his move. He invited Václav to a feast at his stronghold in Stara Boleslav, ostensibly to celebrate the feast of Saints Cosmas and Damian. Václav came in good faith, suspecting nothing. The next morning, as Václav was walking to church for morning prayers, Boleslav confronted him. The brothers argued, and then Boleslav struck. When Václav tried to flee to the church, Boleslav's men cut him down at the door. The murder of Václav by his own brother shocked the Christian world, but it also created something powerful, a martyr and a saint. Almost immediately, miracles were reported at Václav's tomb. His cult spread rapidly, not only in Bohemia, but across Europe. He became the patron saint of the Czech people, a symbol of their Christian identity and their aspirations for justice and peace. The famous Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslas, was written much later in the 19th century by an English hymn writer. The story it tells of the king braving winter weather to bring food to a poor peasant is not based on any specific historical event. but it captures something true about Václav's reputation for charity and compassion. He remains one of the most beloved figures in Czech history, and his image appears on Czech coins to this day. Meanwhile, Boleslav, forever after known as Boleslav the Cruel, took power in Bohemia. Despite his violent path to the throne, Boleslav proved to be an effective ruler in many ways. He expanded Bohemian territory significantly, conquering Moravia, Silesia, and parts of what is now southern Poland. He strengthened the central authority of the Přemyslid dynasty and reduced the power of rival clans. He continued the Christianization of Bohemia despite having murdered his saintly brother. Boleslav ruled for over 30 years, until his death around 987 or 972. He was succeeded by his son, Boleslav II, who continued his father's policies of expansion and consolidation. Under Boleslav II, Prague became the seat of a new bishopric in 973, with its own bishop answering to the Archbishop of Mainz. This was a crucial step in establishing Bohemia's ecclesiastical independence and prestige. But Boleslav II also committed one of the darkest acts in early Czech history. In 995, he ordered the massacre of the Slavnik clan, the last significant rivals to Přemyslid dominance. The Slavniks had controlled eastern Bohemia from their stronghold at Libice, and they had maintained their own connections to foreign powers. On September 28th, the anniversary of Saint Václav's martyrdom, Přemyslid forces attacked Libice and killed nearly every member of the Slavnik family. Only a few Slavniks survived, including one who was away from Bohemia at the time. His name was Wojciech, and he would become famous throughout Europe as Saint Adalbert of Prague. Wojciech had been appointed Bishop of Prague in 983, but his relationship with the Přemyslids was troubled. He was a reformer who clashed with the nobility over issues like the slave trade and clerical marriage. After the massacre of his family, he left Bohemia forever. Wojciech travelled widely, eventually joining a mission to convert the pagan Prussians on the Baltic coast. There in 997, he was martyred, killed by pagan warriors. His body was ransomed by the Polish Duke Bolesław the Brave, who made Wojciech's cult a centerpiece of Polish Christianity. Wojciech became Saint Adalbert, one of the most important saints in Central European history, venerated in Poland, Hungary, and eventually in Bohemia itself. The deaths of Václav and Wojciech gave Bohemia two powerful patron saints and connected the young Czech church to the broader world of European Christianity. Churches were dedicated to them, their relics were treasured, and their stories were told and retold. They became symbols of Czech identity, reminders that Bohemia was part of the Christian civilization of Europe. The 11th century brought new challenges and opportunities for the Přemyslid dynasty. The Dukes of Bohemia had to navigate complex relationships with the Holy Roman Empire, the powerful German-speaking realm that claimed authority over much of Central Europe. Sometimes this meant conflict. More often, it meant careful diplomacy, balancing submission to imperial authority with the preservation of Bohemian autonomy. Duke Mstislav I, who ruled from 1035 to 1055, was one of the most dynamic Přemyslids of this era. He launched a daring raid into Poland in 1039, capturing the relics of St. Adalbert and bringing them back to Prague. This was both a religious act and a political statement, asserting Bohemia's importance in the Christian world. Mstislav also tried to establish a clear law of succession, decreeing that the eldest member of the Přemyslid family should always inherit the throne. This was meant to prevent the kind of fratricidal violence that had marked earlier generations. Unfortunately, the law of seniority did not work as Mstislav had hoped. It created constant competition among the many branches of the Přemyslid family, with uncles, nephews and cousins all claiming rights to the throne. The 11th and 12th centuries saw frequent conflicts over succession, with various Přemyslids gaining and losing power in rapid succession. The Holy Roman Emperors often intervened in these disputes, supporting one candidate or another in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Despite this political instability, Bohemia continued to develop economically and culturally. New towns were founded. Trade routes connected Bohemia to distant markets. The silver mines that would later bring enormous wealth were beginning to be exploited. Monasteries were established, becoming centres of learning, agriculture, and manuscript production. The Romanesque style of architecture spread across the land, with sturdy stone churches replacing earlier wooden structures. Then came a turning point that would transform Bohemia's status forever. In 1085, Duke Vratislav II received a remarkable honour from Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. In recognition of his loyal support during the emperor's conflicts with the Pope, Vratislav was granted the title of king. He became Vratislav I, King of Bohemia. This was a personal title, not a hereditary one. It applied only to Vratislav himself, not to his successors. But it established a crucial precedent. Bohemia was no longer merely a duchy. It had been recognized as a kingdom, even if only temporarily. The seed had been planted for Bohemia's eventual elevation to permanent royal status. Vratislav reigned as king until his death in 1092. After him, his successors reverted to the title of duke, but the memory of the royal title remained, a goal for future Přemyslids to pursue. Over the following century, several dukes received the royal title as a personal honour, but none managed to make it permanent and hereditary. The breakthrough came with Přemysl Otakar I, one of the most capable rulers in Czech history. Přemysl Otakar came to power in 1198 after years of civil war among the Přemyslids. He was a shrewd politician who understood how to exploit the conflicts among the great powers of Europe. At this time, the Holy Roman Empire was torn by a succession dispute between two rival candidates, Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick. Přemysl Otakar played both sides, switching his support back and forth in exchange for concessions. His ultimate reward came in 1212, when the young Emperor Frederick II issued a document known as the Golden Bull of Sicily. The Golden Bull of Sicily was one of the most important documents in Czech history. It confirmed that Bohemia was a kingdom, with the royal title passing hereditarily to Přemysl Otakar and his descendants. It granted the Bohemian king significant autonomy within the empire, including the right to invest his own bishops and freedom from most imperial obligations. It established that the Bohemian king would be one of the electors who chose future Holy Roman emperors. With the Golden Bull of Sicily, Bohemia's transformation from duchy to kingdom was complete. The Přemyslids were no longer merely dukes dependent on imperial favour. They were kings in their own right, with a permanent place among the highest nobility of Europe. The Kingdom of Bohemia had truly arrived. Přemysl Otakar I ruled until 1230, overseeing a period of growth and consolidation. His son, Wenceslas I, continued his policies, though his reign was troubled by a Mongol invasion that devastated much of Central Europe in 1241. Bohemia was largely spared the worst of the Mongol onslaught, partly due to geography and partly due to the Mongols' sudden withdrawal after the death of their great Khan. Wenceslas I also faced challenges from his own son, the future Přemysl Otakar II, who rebelled against his father in the 1240s. This conflict was eventually resolved, and when Wenceslas died in 1253, Přemysl Otakar II inherited a stable and prosperous kingdom. The transformation of Bohemia from a mere duchy into a fully recognised kingdom was not a single event, but a gradual process spanning more than a century. It involved careful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the exploitation of opportunities that arose from the complex politics of medieval Europe. We have already touched on the first bestowal of the royal title in 1085, when Emperor Henry IV made Vratislav II into King Vratislav I. This was a reward for Vratislav's loyal support during the investiture controversy, the great conflict between the Holy Roman Emperors and the popes over who had the right to appoint bishops and other church officials. Vratislav had stood firmly with Henry against Pope Gregory VII, even when many German princes abandoned the emperor. He led Bohemian troops in imperial campaigns and proved himself a valuable ally. The royal title was Henry's way of thanking him and binding him even more closely to the imperial cause. But the title died with Vratislav. His successors were once again dukes, not kings. The precedent had been set, however. Future Přemyslids knew that the royal crown was attainable if they could find the right circumstances and the right imperial patron. The 12th century saw several more temporary grants of the royal title. Vladislav II received it in 1158 from Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, again as a reward for military support. Vladislav had provided crucial assistance during Frederick's Italian campaigns, and the royal title was his payment. But once again, the title was personal, not hereditary. When Vladislav abdicated in 1172, his successors reverted to ducal status. These repeated grants and withdrawals of the royal title highlight the dependent relationship between Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian rulers were powerful within their own lands, but they were still subordinate to the emperor. The royal title was a gift that could be given and taken away, not an inherent right. This began to change with Přemysl Otakar I. He came to power in 1198, during one of the most chaotic periods in imperial history. Emperor Henry VI had died in 1197, leaving a young son, the future Frederick II, who was too young to rule. Two rival candidates claimed the imperial throne: Philip of Swabia, Henry's brother, and Otto of Brunswick, supported by the Pope and the English king. Přemysl Otakar was a master at playing both sides. He initially supported Philip, receiving recognition of his royal title in return. When Philip was assassinated in 1208, Přemysl Otakar switched his support to Otto. When Otto fell out of favour with the Pope and faced rebellion, Přemysl Otakar shifted again to support the young Frederick II, who was emerging as a serious contender for the throne. This skillful manoeuvring paid off handsomely. Frederick II was grateful for Přemysl Otakar's support and eager to secure it for the future. In September of 1212, Frederick issued a document that would change Bohemian history forever. This document is known as the Golden Bull of Sicily, named for the golden seal that authenticated it and the island where Frederick held court at the time. The Golden Bull of Sicily was remarkable in its generosity. It confirmed that Bohemia was a kingdom, not merely a duchy. More importantly, it declared that the royal title was hereditary, passing from father to son in the Přemyslid line. No longer would each new ruler have to beg the emperor for recognition. The crown belonged to the Přemyslids by right. But the Golden Bull granted much more than just a title. It gave the Bohemian king extraordinary autonomy within the Holy Roman Empire. The King of Bohemia had the right to invest his own bishops, a privilege that most rulers in the empire did not possess. He was exempt from attending imperial diets, except those held in cities close to Bohemia's borders. He owed no military service to the emperor, except for campaigns into Italy, and even then he could fulfill this obligation by paying money instead of sending troops. Perhaps most significantly, the Golden Bull confirmed that the King of Bohemia was one of the prince-electors of the Holy Roman Empire. These electors were the small group of princes who had the right to choose each new emperor. Being an elector placed the Bohemian king among the highest nobility of the empire, with influence over the succession to the imperial throne itself. The Golden Bull of Sicily was not just a legal document, it was a declaration of Bohemia's special status. The kingdom was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not like other parts. It had its own laws, its own church hierarchy, and its own royal dynasty. It was, in effect, a kingdom within an empire, enjoying the benefits of imperial protection while maintaining substantial independence. Przemysl Otakar I had achieved something extraordinary. Through patient diplomacy and shrewd political calculation, he had secured for his dynasty and his kingdom a position of permanent prestige. He would rule for another 18 years after receiving the Golden Bull, dying in 1230 as one of the most successful monarchs in Czech history. His success was built on more than just clever politics. Przemysl Otakar also oversaw significant economic and social development within Bohemia. He encouraged the founding of new towns, granting them charters that gave their inhabitants special rights and freedoms. These towns became centres of trade and craftsmanship, contributing to Bohemia's growing prosperity. He also promoted the immigration of German settlers into Bohemia. This was part of a broader movement known as the Ostsiedlung, or Eastern Settlement, in which German-speaking colonists moved into lands across Central and Eastern Europe. These settlers brought new agricultural techniques, new crafts, and new ideas. They founded towns, cleared forests, and developed mining operations. Their presence would have lasting effects on Bohemia's economy and culture. The relationship between Czech and German populations in Bohemia would become complicated over the centuries, sometimes harmonious and sometimes tense. But in the 13th century, the German settlers were generally welcomed as contributors to Bohemia's development. They lived alongside the Czech population, each community maintaining its own language and customs, while participating in the shared life of the kingdom. Przemysl Otakar I was succeeded by his son, Wenceslas I, who ruled from 1230 to 1253. Wenceslas continued his father's policies of development and expansion. He was a cultured man who patronized the arts, particularly poetry. The tradition of courtly love poetry, which had flourished in France and Germany, found a home at the Bohemian court under Wenceslas. But Wenceslas's reign was also marked by crisis. In 1241, the Mongol Empire launched a devastating invasion of Europe. Mongol armies swept through Poland and Hungary, destroying everything in their path. The Battle of Legnica in April 1241 saw a combined Polish and German force annihilated by the Mongols. It seemed that nothing could stop the invaders from conquering all of Europe. Bohemia prepared for the worst. Wenceslas gathered his forces and strengthened his fortifications. But then, unexpectedly, the Mongols withdrew. The great Khan Ergedei had died in distant Mongolia, and the Mongol princes needed to return home to participate in choosing his successor. Europe was saved not by its own strength, but by events thousands of miles away. Bohemia had escaped the Mongol devastation that had befallen Poland and Hungary. This stroke of fortune allowed the kingdom to continue its development while its neighbours struggled to recover. The contrast would become even more apparent in the following decades as Bohemia rose to become the dominant power in Central Europe. Wenceslas I also had to deal with conflict within his own family. His son, the future Przemysl Otakar II, was impatient for power and rebelled against his father in the 1240s. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, and father and son reconciled. But it was a reminder that even successful dynasties faced internal tensions that could threaten their stability. When Wenceslas died in 1253, Przemysl Ottokar II inherited a kingdom that was prosperous, secure, and respected. But he would not be satisfied with merely maintaining what he had received. He had ambitions that would make him the most powerful ruler Bohemia had ever known, and one of the most powerful in all of Europe. Before we turn to his remarkable story, let us consider what Bohemia had become by the mid-13th century. It was a kingdom with a permanent royal dynasty, special privileges within the Holy Roman Empire, and a growing economy based on agriculture, trade, and mining. Its capital, Prague, was developing into a significant city with a castle complex overlooking the river, churches and monasteries dotting the landscape, and a growing population of merchants and craftsmen. The kingdom had two patron saints, Václav and Wojtek, whose cults connected Bohemia to the broader Christian world. It had a church hierarchy headed by the Bishop of Prague, who answered to the Archbishop of Mainz, but enjoyed considerable independence. It had a nobility that was powerful but generally loyal to the Przemyslid dynasty, and it had a population that was increasingly conscious of its identity as Bohemians, subjects of a kingdom with its own history and destiny. The transformation from duchy to kingdom was complete, but the story of the Kingdom of Bohemia was only beginning. Among all the kings who ever ruled Bohemia, none cast a longer shadow than Przemysl Ottokar II. He was called the Iron and Golden King, iron for his military prowess and golden for the wealth and splendour of his realm. During his reign, Bohemia reached heights of power it had never known before and would not know again for nearly a century. His story is one of breathtaking ambition, stunning success, and ultimately tragic downfall. Przemysl Ottokar was born around 1233, the second son of King Wenceslas I. As a younger son, he was not originally expected to inherit the throne. His older brother Vladislav was the heir apparent, but Vladislav died young in 1247, and suddenly Przemysl Ottokar found himself next in line for the crown. Even before becoming king, Przemysl Ottokar showed his ambition. He led the rebellion against his father in the 1240s, impatient to exercise power. Though the rebellion failed and he reconciled with Wenceslas, it demonstrated a restless energy that would characterize his entire career. His opportunity for expansion came from an unexpected direction. The neighbouring Duchy of Austria had been ruled by the Babenberg dynasty for centuries, but in 1246 the last male Babenberg, Duke Frederick II, died in battle against the Hungarians. He left no sons and Austria was suddenly without a ruler. This created a succession crisis that drew in powers from across Central Europe. Several claimants emerged, including the King of Hungary and various German princes. Przemysl Ottokar saw his chance. In 1251, while still only heir to the Bohemian throne, he marched into Austria and claimed the duchy for himself. His claim was based on marriage. He wed Margaret of Babenberg, the sister of the last duke, and a woman nearly 30 years his senior. Margaret was around 50 years old at the time, well past childbearing age. The marriage was purely political, designed to give Przemysl Ottokar a legal basis for his takeover of Austria. It was not a love match, and the couple would eventually separate. But it served its purpose, establishing Przemysl Ottokar as Duke of Austria. When his father Wenceslas died in 1253, Przemysl Ottokar became King of Bohemia as well. He now ruled two of the most important territories in Central Europe. But he was far from satisfied. Over the following years, Przemysl Ottokar expanded his domains with a remarkable speed. In 1260, he defeated King Bela IV of Hungary at the Battle of Kressenbrunn, one of the largest battles fought in Central Europe during the entire medieval period. This victory secured his hold on Austria and added the Duchy of Styria to his possessions. He continued to expand. Carinthia and Carniola, territories in what is now Slovenia and southern Austria, came under his control. He extended his influence into Friuli in northeastern Italy. By the late 1260s, Przemysl Ottokar ruled a vast domain stretching from the Sudeten Mountains in the north to the Adriatic Sea in the south. No Bohemian king before or after would control such extensive territories. His power was not based solely on conquest. Przemysl Ottokar was also a great builder and administrator. He founded numerous towns throughout his domains, granting them charters and encouraging their development. Many cities in Austria, Styria, and Bohemia trace their origins or their growth to his reign. He was particularly active in promoting urban development in Bohemia itself. New towns sprang up across the kingdom, populated by both Czech and German settlers. These towns had regular street plans, market squares, and defensive walls. They were centres of trade and craftsmanship, contributing to the kingdom's prosperity. Przemysl Ottokar also encouraged the development of mining. Bohemia was rich in silver, and under his rule, the extraction of this precious metal increased significantly. The silver mines would become even more important under his successors, but the foundations were laid during his reign. His court was a centre of culture and learning. Poets, scholars, and artists gathered in Prague, attracted by the king's patronage and the sophistication of his court. The tradition of German-language courtly poetry flourished, with Przemysl Ottokar himself portrayed as an ideal of chivalric kingship. But perhaps Przemysl Ottokar's most lasting legacy was his involvement in the crusading movement in the Baltic region. The pagan Prussians and Lithuanians of the eastern Baltic had long resisted Christianization, and the Teutonic Knights were waging a continuous crusade to conquer and convert them. Przemysl Ottokar participated in these Baltic crusades on multiple occasions. In 1254 and 1255, he led a major expedition that helped the Teutonic Knights conquer the Sambians, one of the Prussian tribes. During this campaign, a new fortress was founded and named Königsberg in his honour, meaning King's Mountain. This city would later become a major centre of German culture in the east and is today known as Kaliningrad in Russia. The Baltic Crusades enhanced Przemysl Ottokar's reputation as a Christian warrior king. They connected him to the broader European crusading movement and demonstrated his power to project force far beyond his own borders. He was not just a regional ruler, but a figure of European significance. By the early 1270s, Przemysl Ottokar seemed to be at the height of his power. He controlled territories that made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He was wealthy, respected, and feared. When the Holy Roman Emperor Richard of Cornwall died in 1272, Przemysl Ottokar was considered a leading candidate to succeed him. But here his fortunes began to turn. The imperial election of 1273 did not go as he had hoped. The other electors, wary of Przemysl Ottokar's power and ambition, chose instead a relatively obscure count named Rudolf of Habsburg. Rudolf was not a weak man, but he was not as powerful as Przemysl Ottokar, and the electors believed they could control him more easily. Przemysl Ottokar refused to accept Rudolf's election. He did not attend the coronation and did not pay homage to the new emperor. This was a direct challenge to Rudolf's authority, and Rudolf could not let it stand. The conflict between Przemysl Ottokar and Rudolf of Habsburg would shape the future of Central Europe for centuries. Rudolf demanded that Przemysl Ottokar surrender the territories he had acquired, arguing that Austria, Styria, and the other lands were imperial fiefs that had been illegally seized. Przemysl Ottokar refused. War became inevitable. Rudolf gathered allies, including the King of Hungary and several German princes who resented Przemysl Ottokar's power. The Bohemian king found himself increasingly isolated. Even some of his own nobles, unhappy with his autocratic style of rule, began to waver in their loyalty. In 1276, Rudolf invaded Austria. Przemysl Ottokar, facing rebellion among his own subjects and unable to match Rudolf's coalition, was forced to submit. He surrendered Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, keeping only Bohemia and Moravia. He was compelled to pay homage to Rudolf, kneeling before the emperor in a humiliating ceremony that was deliberately staged to maximize his shame. But Przemysl Ottokar was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. He spent the following months rebuilding his strength, seeking new allies, and preparing for a rematch. In 1278, he launched a new war against Rudolf, determined to recover his lost territories and avenge his humiliation. The decisive confrontation came on August 26, 1278, at the Battle of Marchfeld, fought on the plains north of Vienna. It was one of the largest and bloodiest battles of medieval Central European history. Przemysl Ottokar led his forces personally, fighting in the thick of the combat as a medieval king was expected to do. The battle was fiercely contested, but in the end, Rudolf's forces prevailed. Przemysl Ottokar was killed in the fighting, though the exact circumstances of his death are unclear. Some accounts say he was killed in battle, others suggest he was murdered after being captured, cut down by personal enemies who took advantage of the chaos. Whatever the truth, the Iron and Golden King was dead at around 45 years of age. His body was reportedly so mutilated that it could barely be identified. His vast empire outside of Bohemia was lost forever. The Habsburgs, who had been minor counts before Rudolf's election, would take Austria and build it into the foundation of a dynasty that would dominate Central Europe for the next 600 years. The death of Przemysl Ottokar II was a catastrophe for Bohemia. The kingdom lost not only its greatest king, but also its position as the dominant power in Central Europe. The territories that Przemysl Ottokar had conquered, Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, passed to the Habsburgs and would never return to Bohemian control. Yet Przemysl Ottokar's legacy endured. He had shown what Bohemia could achieve under strong leadership. He had built towns, encouraged trade, and developed the kingdom's resources. He had made Bohemia a major player in European affairs, even if that position could not be sustained after his death. His memory lived on in Czech consciousness as a symbol of national greatness. Later generations looked back on his reign as a golden age, a time when Bohemia had been powerful and respected. The contrast with later periods of foreign domination made his memory even more poignant. Przemysl Ottokar II was buried in Prague in the Church of St. Francis. His tomb became a site of remembrance, a reminder of what Bohemia had once been and what it might become again. The death of Przemysl Ottokar II left Bohemia in a precarious position. The kingdom had lost its most powerful ruler, its extensive territories outside Bohemia, and its dominant position in Central Europe. The heir to the throne was Przemysl Ottokar's son, Wenceslas, who was only 7 years old at the time of his father's death. A child king was always vulnerable, and young Wenceslas faced immediate threats. Rudolf of Habsburg, the victor of Marchfeld, occupied parts of Bohemia and demanded recognition of his authority. The Bohemian nobility, some of whom had resented Przemysl Ottokar's strong rule, saw an opportunity to increase their own power at the expense of the crown. The regency period was chaotic. various factions competed for control of the young king and the government. Otto of Brandenburg, who had been appointed guardian of Wenceslas, used his position to exploit Bohemia's resources for his own benefit. The kingdom suffered from misrule and instability, but Wenceslas survived, and when he came of age he proved to be a capable ruler in his own right. He could not recover the territories his father had lost, but he consolidated Przemyslid power within Bohemia and found new sources of wealth and influence. The key to Wenceslas II's success was silver. Bohemia had always had silver deposits, but in the late 13th century, new and incredibly rich veins were discovered near a town that would become known as Kutna Hora. This was one of the largest silver strikes in medieval European history, and it transformed Bohemia's economy. The silver mines of Kutna Hora produced enormous quantities of precious metal. At their peak, they may have accounted for a third of all the silver produced in Europe. This wealth flowed into the royal treasury, giving Wenceslas resources that his predecessors could only have dreamed of. Wenceslas used this wealth wisely. He reformed Bohemia's currency, introducing a new silver coin called the Prague groschen. This coin was of high quality and consistent weight, making it trusted throughout Central Europe. The Prague groschen became one of the most important currencies of the medieval period, accepted in markets from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The silver wealth also allowed Wenceslas to pursue an ambitious foreign policy. He could not challenge the Habsburgs directly, but he could expand Bohemian influence in other directions. His opportunity came from Poland, which was fragmented into numerous competing duchies with no strong central authority. Through a combination of diplomacy, marriage, and military pressure, Wenceslas gradually extended his influence over the Polish lands. In 1300 he was crowned King of Poland, uniting the two kingdoms under his rule. It was a remarkable achievement, creating a realm that stretched from the Bohemian forest to the Baltic Sea. But Wenceslas was not finished. He also had claims to the Kingdom of Hungary, through his marriage to a Hungarian princess and the complex web of Central European dynastic politics. In 1301, his son, also named Wenceslas, was elected King of Hungary. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Przemyslids might unite all three major kingdoms of Central Europe under their rule. This was too much for the other powers of Europe to accept. The Habsburgs, the papacy, and various German princes all opposed the growth of Przemyslid power. Wenceslas faced a coalition of enemies determined to prevent the creation of a Central European superstate under Bohemian leadership. The situation was further complicated by the young Wenceslas's inability to establish himself firmly in Hungary. He faced constant opposition from Hungarian nobles who preferred a native ruler. Eventually, he renounced his claim to the Hungarian throne, and the crown passed to Charles Robert of the Angevin dynasty. Wenceslas II died in 1305 at only 34 years of age. He had accomplished much in his short life, rebuilding Bohemian power after the catastrophe of Marchfeld and extending Przemyslid rule to Poland. But his death left the dynasty in a vulnerable position once again. The new king was Wenceslas III, who was only 16 years old. He inherited Bohemia and Poland, but his hold on both kingdoms was tenuous. The Polish nobles were restive under Bohemian rule, and powerful enemies surrounded the young king on all sides. Wenceslas III tried to consolidate his position. He prepared a military campaign to reassert his authority in Poland, which was slipping away from Przemyslid control. But before he could launch his campaign, disaster struck. On August 4th, 1306, Wenceslas III was assassinated in Olomouc in Moravia. He was stabbed to death by an unknown assailant. The identity and motives of the killer have never been definitively established. Some suspected agents of the Habsburgs, others blamed disgruntled Polish nobles. Still others pointed to personal enemies within the Bohemian court. Whatever the truth, the consequences were catastrophic. Wenceslas III had no children and no brothers. With his death, the male line of the Przemyslid dynasty came to an end. The family that had ruled Bohemia for over 400 years, from the legendary Przemysl the ploughman to the murdered young king, was extinct. Bohemia was plunged into a succession crisis. The throne was suddenly vacant, and multiple claimants emerged to contest it. The kingdom that had been so powerful under Przemysl Ottokar II and so wealthy under Wenceslas II now faced an uncertain future. The first to seize the opportunity was Henry of Carinthia, who was married to Anna, the older sister of Wenceslas III. Henry claimed the throne through his wife and was accepted by a faction of the Bohemian nobility. He was crowned king in 1306, but Henry proved to be a disastrous ruler. He was weak, indecisive, and unable to command the respect of the Bohemian nobles. He could not control the powerful aristocratic families who had grown accustomed to dominating the government during the chaotic years after Przemysl Ottokar's death. His reign was marked by disorder, factional conflict, and economic decline. The Bohemian nobles grew increasingly dissatisfied with Henry. They looked for an alternative, someone who could restore stability and strong government to the kingdom. Their attention turned to the House of Luxembourg, a rising dynasty in the western part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Luxembourgs were not as powerful as the Habsburgs, but they were ambitious and capable. The head of the family, Henry VII, had recently been elected Holy Roman Emperor, giving the dynasty enormous prestige. He had a son, John, who was young, energetic, and available for marriage. A deal was struck. John of Luxembourg would marry Elizabeth, the younger sister of Wenceslas III and the last surviving Przemyslid princess. Through this marriage, John would have a legitimate claim to the Bohemian throne. In return, he would bring the resources and support of the Luxembourg dynasty to restore order in Bohemia. In 1310, John of Luxembourg arrived in Bohemia with an army. Henry of Carinthia, abandoned by most of his supporters, fled without a fight. John was crowned King of Bohemia, beginning a new chapter in the kingdom's history. The Przemyslid dynasty was gone, but its legacy endured. The Przemyslids had transformed Bohemia from a collection of Slavic tribes into a Christian kingdom. They had produced saints and warriors, builders and statesmen. They had made Bohemia a significant power in European affairs and had established institutions that would outlast their rule. The new Luxembourg dynasty would build on these foundations, bringing Bohemia to even greater heights of power and cultural achievement. But the Przemyslids would never be forgotten. They remained a symbol of Czech identity and continuity, a reminder that the Kingdom of Bohemia had deep roots stretching back to the earliest days of Czech history. The arrival of the Luxembourg dynasty brought Bohemia a new ruling family, but the transition was not smooth. John of Luxembourg, who became king in 1310, was a fascinating figure, but he was not particularly interested in governing Bohemia. He was a knight-errant at heart, more interested in tournaments, wars and adventures across Europe than in the daily business of ruling his kingdom. John spent much of his reign away from Bohemia, fighting in wars that had little to do with his kingdom's interests. He participated in crusades against the pagan Lithuanians. He intervened in Italian politics. He fought for the French king against the English. He was brave, chivalrous, and utterly impractical as a ruler. His absences left Bohemia in the hands of the nobility, who used the opportunity to increase their own power. The strong central government that the later Přemyslids had built began to erode. The kingdom drifted, lacking clear direction or effective leadership. But John did one thing of enormous importance for Bohemia's future. He raised his son Charles to be a king. Charles was born in 1316, the first child of John and his wife Elizabeth, the Přemyslid princess. From an early age it was clear that Charles was different from his father. Where John was impulsive and restless, Charles was thoughtful and deliberate. Where John neglected his kingdom, Charles would devote his life to building it up. Charles's education was remarkable for its breadth and sophistication. When he was 7 years old, his father sent him to the French court, where he was raised under the supervision of the French king and received an education befitting a future monarch. He learned Latin, French, German, Czech, and Italian. He studied theology, law, and the arts of government. He absorbed the culture of the most sophisticated court in Europe. This French education shaped Charles profoundly. He developed a love of learning and culture that would characterize his entire reign. He came to see kingship not just as a matter of military power, but as a responsibility to promote justice, learning, and the welfare of his subjects. Charles returned to Bohemia in 1333 when he was 17 years old. His father appointed him Margrave of Moravia, giving him responsibility for governing part of the Přemyslid inheritance. Charles threw himself into the work, reforming administration, promoting economic development, and beginning the long task of rebuilding royal authority. He found Bohemia in a sorry state. The years of his father's neglect had taken their toll. The royal treasury was empty. The nobility had seized royal lands and revenues. The infrastructure of government had decayed. Charles later wrote in his autobiography that he found the kingdom so devastated that there was not a single royal castle that had not been pawned to creditors. Charles set to work with determination and skill. He recovered royal properties that had been alienated. He reformed the administration of justice. He encouraged trade and economic development. Slowly, he began to restore the strength of the Bohemian crown. Meanwhile, his father John continued his adventurous ways. In 1346, John joined the French army in its war against England. By this time, John was completely blind, having lost his sight to an illness some years earlier. But blindness did not diminish his love of battle. At the Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, John insisted on joining the fighting. He ordered his knights to tie their horses to his so that he could ride into combat with them. Together, they charged into the English lines. John of Luxembourg, the blind king, died on the field of Crécy, fighting to the end in the manner he had always lived. Charles, who was also present at Crécy, survived the battle and inherited his father's crown. But he had already achieved something even more significant. A few weeks before Crécy, Charles had been elected King of the Romans, the title given to the heir apparent to the Holy Roman Empire. When Emperor Louis IV died in 1347, Charles became Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. Charles now held two of the most prestigious titles in Europe. He was King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor. He would use both positions to elevate Bohemia to unprecedented heights of power and prestige. Charles made Bohemia the centre of his empire. Unlike previous emperors who had ruled from Germany, Charles established his primary residence in Prague. He poured resources into developing the city, transforming it from a prosperous but provincial capital into one of the great cities of Europe. His building projects were extraordinary in their scope and ambition. He founded the new town of Prague in 1348, a massive expansion that tripled the size of the city. The new town was laid out on a grand scale, with broad streets, large market squares, and plots for churches, monasteries, and public buildings. It was one of the largest urban planning projects of the medieval period. Charles also began the construction of St. Vitus Cathedral, the great Gothic church that still dominates the Prague skyline. He brought in architects and craftsmen from across Europe to work on this project, creating a masterpiece of Gothic architecture that would take centuries to complete. He built the famous Charles Bridge across the Vltava River, replacing an older bridge that had been destroyed by floods. The Charles Bridge was an engineering marvel, built to withstand the river's powerful currents. It was decorated with statues of saints and became one of the most iconic structures in Prague. He constructed Karlstein Castle, a magnificent fortress designed to house the imperial crown jewels and holy relics. Karlstein was built on a hill southwest of Prague, its towers and walls creating a striking silhouette against the sky. The interior was decorated with precious stones and paintings, creating spaces of extraordinary beauty. But Charles's most lasting contribution to Bohemia was not a building, it was an institution. In 1348, he founded Charles University in Prague, the first university in Central Europe. This was a momentous event, placing Prague among the great centres of learning in Europe, alongside Paris, Oxford and Bologna. Charles University attracted scholars and students from across the empire and beyond. It had 4 faculties: theology, law, medicine, and the arts. It became a centre of intellectual life, producing scholars, administrators, and clergy who would shape the future of Bohemia and Central Europe. The founding of the university reflected Charles's deep commitment to learning and culture. He was himself a learned man who wrote an autobiography, composed religious texts, and collected books and manuscripts. He saw education as essential to good government and to the welfare of his subjects. Charles also worked to define the constitutional structure of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1356 he issued the Golden Bull of 1356, one of the most important constitutional documents in European history. This document established the procedures for electing the Holy Roman Emperor and defined the rights and privileges of the 7 electors who chose him. The Golden Bull confirmed that the King of Bohemia was one of these 7 electors, the only one who was not German. It granted the Bohemian king precedence over the other secular electors and confirmed Bohemia's special status within the empire. It also established that Bohemia was indivisible and that the Bohemian crown would pass by hereditary succession, not election. The Golden Bull of 1356 remained the fundamental constitutional law of the Holy Roman Empire until the empire's dissolution in 1806. It was a testament to Charles's skill as a statesman and his ability to create lasting institutions. Under Charles, Prague became one of the largest and most important cities in Europe. Its population may have reached 40,000 or more, making it comparable to Paris or London. It was a cosmopolitan city where Czechs, Germans, Jews, and people from across Europe lived and worked together. The city was a centre of trade, with merchants dealing in goods from across the known world. It was a centre of craftsmanship, famous for its goldsmiths, armourers, and other skilled artisans. It was a centre of culture, with poets, musicians, and artists gathering at the imperial court. Charles was also deeply religious, and his piety shaped his rule. He collected relics of saints from across Europe, assembling one of the greatest collections of holy objects in Christendom. He founded churches and monasteries. He promoted the veneration of Bohemia's patron saints, Václav and Wojciech, as symbols of the kingdom's Christian identity. His reign was not without challenges. The Black Death reached Bohemia in 1349, killing perhaps a third of the population. Charles responded with practical measures to limit the spread of the disease and to help communities recover. He also faced periodic conflicts with the nobility, who resented his efforts to strengthen royal authority. But overall, Charles's reign was a golden age for Bohemia. The kingdom was at peace, prosperous, and respected throughout Europe. Its king was also the emperor, placing Bohemia at the very centre of European politics. Its capital was one of the great cities of the continent. Its university was a beacon of learning. Charles ruled for over 30 years, dying in 1378 at the age of 62. He was buried in St. Vitus Cathedral, the great church he had done so much to build. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage, visited by those who remembered his reign as a time of greatness. Charles IV is often called the Father of the Country, a title that reflects his central place in Czech national memory. He was not a native Czech, being half Luxembourg and half Přemyslid, and he spent his early years in France. But he identified deeply with Bohemia, learned the Czech language, and devoted his life to the kingdom's welfare. His legacy endured long after his death. The institutions he created, the buildings he constructed, and the prestige he brought to Bohemia shaped the kingdom for generations. Charles University still exists today, one of the oldest and most respected universities in Europe. The Charles Bridge still spans the Vltava. St. Vitus Cathedral still watches over Prague. Charles IV transformed Bohemia from a prosperous kingdom into a European power of the first rank. He showed what Bohemia could achieve under wise and dedicated leadership. His reign set a standard against which all future Bohemian rulers would be measured, and few would match his accomplishments. But Charles also left behind problems that would trouble his successors. His building projects and his ambitious policies had strained the royal finances. The nobility had grown powerful during the long years of Luxembourg rule, and they were not easily controlled. And beneath the surface of Bohemia's prosperity, religious tensions were beginning to simmer that would eventually explode into one of the most dramatic upheavals in European history. Charles was succeeded by his son, Wenceslas IV, who inherited the Kingdom of Bohemia and eventually the title of Holy Roman Emperor. But Wenceslas was not the man his father had been. Where Charles was diligent and capable, Wenceslas was erratic and often ineffective. Where Charles commanded respect, Wenceslas inspired frustration and opposition. Wenceslas's reign would see the beginning of the religious revolution that would transform Bohemia and shake the foundations of European Christianity. The reign of Charles IV remains the high point of medieval Bohemian history. It was a time when Bohemia was not merely a kingdom, but the heart of an empire, when Prague was not merely a capital, but one of the great cities of Europe, when the Bohemian king was not merely a ruler, but the most powerful monarch in Christendom. Charles understood that true greatness lay not in conquest, but in building. He built churches and bridges, universities and towns. He built institutions that would outlast him by centuries. He built a legacy that the Czech people still cherish today. When Czechs think of their medieval past, they think first of Charles IV. He is the king who made Prague beautiful, who made Bohemia great, who showed the world what a small kingdom in the heart of Europe could achieve. His statue stands on the Charles Bridge, looking out over the city he loved and transformed. His name is everywhere in Prague, attached to streets and squares and institutions. Charles IV was not perfect. He could be ruthless when necessary, and his policies sometimes favoured his dynasty's interests over those of his subjects. But he was, by the standards of his time, and perhaps any time, a great ruler. He earned the title Father of the Country, and he deserves to be remembered as one of the most remarkable figures in Czech history. The story we are about to tell is one of the most dramatic in all of European history. It is a story of religious passion and political upheaval, of a small kingdom defying the combined powers of Catholic Europe, of peasants and townspeople defeating the finest knights of Germany and Hungary. It is the story of the Hussite Revolution, and it begins with a man named Jan Hus. Jan Hus was born around 1370 in the small town of Husinec in southern Bohemia. His family was not wealthy, but they managed to send young Jan to Prague to study at Charles University. There he proved to be a brilliant student, earning his bachelor's degree, then his master's degree, and eventually becoming a professor and later the rector of the university. Hus was ordained as a priest and became a popular preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. This chapel had been founded specifically for preaching in the Czech language, at a time when most church services were conducted in Latin. Hus's sermons drew large crowds, and he became one of the most influential religious figures in Bohemia. But Hus was not content simply to preach. He was deeply troubled by what he saw as corruption and abuse within the Catholic Church. He criticised the wealth of the clergy, the sale of indulgences, and the moral failings of priests and bishops. He called for reform, for a return to the simplicity and purity of the early Christian Church. Hus was influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe, an English theologian who had challenged many of the doctrines and practices of the Catholic Church. Wycliffe's ideas had been condemned as heretical, but they found a receptive audience in Bohemia. Czech scholars brought Wycliffe's writings back from England, and they circulated among the faculty and students of Charles University. Hus did not accept all of Wycliffe's ideas, but he embraced many of them. He argued that the Bible, not the Pope or church councils, was the ultimate authority in matters of faith. He criticised the practice of withholding the communion cup from lay people, arguing that all Christians should receive both the bread and the wine. He questioned the church's wealth and its involvement in secular politics. These ideas brought Hus into conflict with the church hierarchy. The Archbishop of Prague condemned his teachings and ordered him to stop preaching. When Hus refused, he was excommunicated. But Hus had powerful supporters, including King Wenceslas IV and many of the Bohemian nobility. He continued to preach and write, becoming ever more popular among the Czech people. The conflict came to a head in 1414 when a great church council was convened in the city of Constance in what is now southern Germany. The Council of Constance was called to heal the Great Schism, a crisis that had seen 2 and sometimes 3 rival popes claiming authority over the Catholic Church. But the council also took up the matter of Jan Hus. Hus was summoned to Constance to defend his teachings. He was promised safe conduct by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, the brother of King Wenceslas and the most powerful ruler in Europe. Hus believed that he would have the opportunity to explain his views and that the promise of safe conduct would protect him. He was wrong. When Hus arrived in Constance, he was arrested and imprisoned. The council declared that promises made to heretics were not binding and that the safe conduct did not apply. Hus was put on trial, but he was not given a fair hearing. The outcome was predetermined. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was burned at the stake as a heretic. He refused to recant his teachings, reportedly saying that he would rather die than betray the truth. His last words, according to tradition, were a prayer asking God to forgive his enemies. The execution of Jan Hus sent shockwaves through Bohemia. He was seen not merely as a religious reformer, but as a Czech hero, a man who had stood up for truth against the corrupt and foreign-dominated church hierarchy. His death was viewed as a martyrdom, and it ignited a fury that would transform Bohemia. The Bohemian nobility sent a formal protest to the Council of Constance, bearing the seals of over 400 Czech and Moravian lords. They condemned the execution as an injustice and an insult to the Bohemian nation. This protest was remarkable for its time, a collective act of defiance against the highest authorities of the Catholic Church, but the protest was only the beginning. In the years following Hus's death, his followers, who came to be called Hussites, grew in number and militancy. They demanded reform of the church and justice for their martyred leader. They adopted the chalice as their symbol, representing their insistence that lay people should receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine. The situation in Bohemia grew increasingly tense. King Wenceslas IV, who had supported Hus during his lifetime, tried to maintain order, but he was caught between the Hussites and the Catholic Church. His health was failing, and his authority was weakening. The breaking point came on July 30th, 1419. A Hussite procession was marching through Prague when stones were thrown at them from the windows of the new town hall. The enraged crowd stormed the building and threw several town councillors out of the windows to their deaths. This event, known as the First Defenestration of Prague, marked the beginning of the Hussite Wars. The word defenestration means throwing someone out of a window, and it would become a peculiarly Bohemian form of political expression. The first defenestration was a spontaneous act of mob violence, but it had profound consequences. It demonstrated that the Hussites were willing to use force to defend their beliefs, and it made reconciliation with the Catholic Church nearly impossible. King Wenceslas IV died just a few weeks after the defenestration, possibly from shock at the news. His death created a succession crisis, as his heir was his brother Sigismund. The same emperor who had betrayed Jan Hus at Constance. The Bohemians refused to accept Sigismund as their king, seeing him as a traitor and an enemy of their nation. Sigismund was not a man to accept rejection. He called upon the Pope to declare a crusade against the Hussite heretics, and the Pope obliged. Catholic Europe mobilized for war against Bohemia. The finest knights of Germany, Hungary, and other lands gathered to crush the rebellion and restore the true faith. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in medieval history. The Hussites, led by brilliant commanders and fired by religious zeal, defeated crusade after crusade sent against them. They were not supposed to win. They were peasants and townspeople facing professional soldiers and armoured knights, but they won again and again. The greatest of the Hussite commanders was Jan Žižka. He was a minor nobleman who had served as a mercenary soldier before joining the Hussite cause. By the time the wars began, he was already in his 60s and had lost one eye in earlier fighting. He would lose the other eye during the Hussite wars, becoming completely blind. Yet even blind, he remained one of the most successful military commanders of his age. Žižka revolutionized warfare. He developed new tactics centered on the war wagon, a heavy cart that could be chained together with others to form a mobile fortress. These wagon fortresses, called Wagenburg in German, provided protection for the Hussite infantry and artillery while allowing them to move across the battlefield. The Hussites also made innovative use of early firearms. Handguns and small cannons were mounted on the war wagons, giving the Hussites firepower that could devastate charging cavalry. The combination of wagon fortresses, firearms, and disciplined infantry proved devastating against the traditional tactics of medieval warfare. Žižka won victory after victory. At the Battle of Sudomljes in 1420, his small force defeated a much larger Catholic army. At the Battle of Witkov Hill, also in 1420, he defended Prague against the First Crusade. routing the Crusaders and saving the Hussite capital. At the Battle of Kutna-Hora in 1421, he defeated another crusading army. At the Battle of Niemetzki Brod in 1422, he crushed yet another. The Crusaders learned to fear the Hussites. There are accounts of crusading armies fleeing at the mere sound of Hussite war songs. So terrified were they of facing Žižka's warriors. The image of the blind general leading his wagon fortresses to victory became legendary. Žižka died in 1424, probably from plague, while besieging a castle. But his death did not end the Hussite successes. Other capable commanders emerged to lead the movement, most notably Prokop the Great, who continued the winning streak. The Hussites were not content merely to defend Bohemia. They launched raids into neighbouring territories, spreading destruction and terror across Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Poland. These raids, called the Beautiful Rides by the Hussites, served multiple purposes. They brought plunder to finance the war effort. They punished the enemies of the Hussite cause, and they demonstrated that the Hussites could not be contained within Bohemia's borders. 5 major crusades were launched against the Hussites between 1420 and 1431. All 5 ended in failure. The combined might of Catholic Europe could not defeat the Bohemian heretics. It was an astonishing outcome, a testament to the military skill of the Hussite commanders and the dedication of their followers. But the Hussite movement was not unified. From the beginning, there were divisions between moderate and radical factions. The moderates, often called Utraquists or Calixtines, wanted reform within the Catholic Church. They focused on specific demands, particularly the right of laypeople to receive communion in both kinds. They were willing to negotiate with the Church and with Sigismund. The radicals, often called Taborites after their stronghold at the town of Tabor, wanted more fundamental changes. Some rejected the authority of the Pope entirely. Some questioned traditional doctrines like purgatory and the veneration of saints. Some embraced apocalyptic beliefs, expecting the imminent end of the world and the return of Christ. These divisions weakened the Hussite movement over time. The moderates and radicals increasingly distrusted each other, and their conflict sometimes erupted into violence. The common cause that had united them against the Crusaders began to fray. The turning point came at the Battle of Lipany in 1434. This was not a battle between Hussites and Catholics, but between Hussites and Hussites. The moderate Utraquists, allied with Catholic nobles, faced the radical Taborites and their allies. The battle was fierce and bloody, and the moderates won. Prokop the Great was killed, and the radical wing of the Hussite movement was broken. After Lipany, negotiations between the moderate Hussites and the Catholic Church became possible. The Council of Basel, which had been convened to continue the work of the Council of Constance, agreed to negotiate with the Hussites. The result was the Compacts of Basel, signed in 1436. The compacts were a compromise. The Hussites were allowed to receive communion in both kinds, the central demand that had given them their symbol and their name. In return, they accepted the authority of the Catholic Church in other matters and agreed to recognise Sigismund as King of Bohemia. Sigismund finally entered Prague in 1436, more than 15 years after the death of his brother Wenceslas. He was an old man now, worn out by decades of conflict. He died the following year in 1437, having barely had time to enjoy his hard-won crown. The Hussite wars were over, but their effects would last for centuries. Bohemia remained religiously divided, with a large Utraquist majority and a Catholic minority. The kingdom had asserted its independence against the combined powers of Europe and had won. The Hussite tradition of religious dissent and national resistance became a central part of Czech identity. The Hussites also left a military legacy. Their tactics influenced warfare across Europe. The wagon fortress was adopted by other armies, and the effective use of firearms became increasingly important in the decades that followed. Some historians see the Hussite Wars as a turning point in military history, marking the beginning of the end for the armoured knight and the rise of infantry and artillery. Jan Hus himself became a symbol of Czech national identity. He was remembered as a man who had stood up for truth against overwhelming power, who had died rather than betray his convictions. His image appears on Czech monuments and currency. His death day, July 6th, is a national holiday in the Czech Republic. The Hussite Revolution was a watershed moment in European history. It demonstrated that religious reform movements could challenge the authority of the Catholic Church and survive. It showed that ordinary people, armed with conviction and innovative tactics, could defeat the greatest powers of their age. It planted seeds that would eventually blossom into the Protestant Reformation a century later. Martin Luther, the German reformer who sparked the Reformation in 1517, acknowledged his debt to Jan Hus. According to tradition, Hus had prophesied at his execution that a swan would come after him, whom the church could not burn. Luther saw himself as that swan, continuing the work that Hus had begun. The Hussite Revolution transformed Bohemia. It weakened the power of the Catholic Church and strengthened the position of the nobility. It fostered a sense of Czech national identity, distinct from the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire. It created a tradition of religious tolerance, as the Utraquists and Catholics learned to coexist within the same kingdom. But the revolution also left scars. The wars had devastated parts of the country. The economy had suffered. The religious divisions created tensions that would persist for generations. And the compromise of the Compacts of Basel satisfied no one completely, leaving both Hussites and Catholics feeling that they had been forced to accept less than they deserved. Bohemia emerged from the Hussite Wars as a changed kingdom. It was still part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it had demonstrated its willingness to defy imperial and papal authority. It was still officially Christian, but its Christianity was different from that of its neighbours. It was still ruled by kings, but those kings would have to reckon with a nobility and a people who had shown they would fight for their beliefs. The Hussite Revolution was not the end of Bohemia's religious struggles. The tensions between Catholics and Protestants would continue for centuries, eventually exploding again in the 17th century, with even more devastating consequences. But for now, the kingdom had survived its trial by fire and had emerged, battered but unbroken, into a new era. The death of Emperor Sigismund in 1437 left Bohemia once again facing a succession crisis. Sigismund had no sons, and the question of who would inherit his crown was far from settled. The kingdom that had just emerged from decades of religious warfare now had to navigate the treacherous waters of dynastic politics. Sigismund's heir was his son-in-law Albert of Habsburg, who was married to Sigismund's daughter Elizabeth. Albert was elected King of Bohemia and also inherited the crowns of Hungary and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Habsburgs might establish themselves as the dominant dynasty in Central Europe. But Albert's reign was cut short. He died in 1439, after only 2 years on the throne, while campaigning against the Ottoman Turks. His death created chaos, as he left behind a pregnant wife and no adult heir. When Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Ladislaus, the child was immediately proclaimed king. But a baby could not rule, and the kingdom needed leadership. Bohemia entered a period of regency and uncertainty. Various factions competed for power, and the country drifted without strong central authority. The religious divisions from the Hussite Wars remained unresolved, adding another layer of complexity to the political situation. Into this vacuum stepped a remarkable figure, George of Poděbrady. George was a Czech nobleman who had fought on the Utraquist side during the Hussite Wars. He was a skilled politician and military commander, and he gradually accumulated power during the chaotic years of Ladislaus's minority. When Ladislaus finally came of age and took personal control of his kingdoms, George served as his chief advisor in Bohemia. But Ladislaus died suddenly in 1457 at only 17 years of age, probably from leukemia. He left no children, and once again Bohemia needed a king. This time, the Bohemian estates made a remarkable choice. In 1458 they elected George of Poděbrady as King of Bohemia. George was the first and only Hussite to wear the Bohemian crown. He was not of royal blood, but he had proven himself as a leader, and the estates trusted him to maintain the religious compromise that had ended the Hussite Wars. George's reign was marked by efforts to consolidate his position and maintain peace. He tried to balance the interests of Utraquists and Catholics, preserving the Compact of Basel while avoiding actions that would provoke either side. He was a pragmatic ruler who understood that Bohemia's survival depended on avoiding another religious war. George also had ambitious plans for European peace. He proposed a league of Christian princes that would settle disputes through arbitration rather than war and would unite against the growing threat of the Ottoman Turks. This was a remarkably forward-thinking idea, anticipating concepts of international organisation that would not be realised for centuries. But George faced growing opposition from the Catholic Church. Pope Pius II refused to recognise the Compact of Basel and demanded that Bohemia return fully to Catholic orthodoxy. When George refused, the Pope declared him a heretic and called for a crusade against him. The crusade was led by Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary, who had his own ambitions for the Bohemian crown. War broke out between Bohemia and Hungary, and George found himself fighting for his throne. He held on, but the strain took its toll on his health. George died in 1471, having successfully defended his kingdom, but having failed to establish his family as a new royal dynasty. Before his death, he arranged for the succession to pass to the Jagiellon dynasty of Poland, hoping to secure Bohemia's future through alliance with its powerful northern neighbour. The Jagiellons were one of the great dynasties of late medieval Europe. They had ruled Poland and Lithuania for generations, creating a vast realm stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Now they would add Bohemia to their collection of crowns. Władysław Jagiellon became King of Bohemia in 1471. He was a young man, only 15 years old, and he would prove to be a weak and ineffective ruler. His nickname, Władysław the Good, or sometimes Władysław the Well, referred to his habit of agreeing to whatever was asked of him. He was amiable and well-meaning, but utterly lacking in the strength needed to control the powerful Bohemian nobility. Under Władysław, the power of the Bohemian crown declined dramatically. The nobility seized control of the government, reducing the king to a figurehead. The great lords expanded their estates, increased their control over the peasantry, and dominated the Diet, the assembly of estates that made laws and decided policy. The condition of the peasants worsened significantly during this period. The nobility imposed new obligations and restrictions, gradually reducing the peasants to a state approaching serfdom. The relatively free peasantry of earlier centuries found themselves increasingly bound to the land and subject to the arbitrary authority of their lords. Władysław eventually added another crown to his collection. In 1490, he was elected King of Hungary, uniting the two kingdoms under his rule. But this union did not strengthen either kingdom. Vladislaus continued to be a weak ruler, unable to assert his authority against the nobles in either realm. The religious situation in Bohemia remained complex. The Utraquists were the majority, but they were themselves divided into conservative and more radical factions. The Catholics remained a significant minority, concentrated among the higher nobility and in certain regions. And new religious movements were emerging, including the Unity of Brethren, a group that traced its origins to the radical wing of the Hussite movement. The Unity of Brethren, sometimes called the Bohemian Brethren or Moravian Brethren, rejected both Catholic and Utraquist churches. They emphasized simple living, pacifism, and strict moral discipline. They were persecuted at times, but survived and would eventually have a significant influence on Protestant Christianity. Vladislaus died in 1516, having ruled Bohemia for 45 years without ever establishing effective control over the kingdom. He was succeeded by his son, Louis, who was only 10 years old. Another regency followed, and the pattern of weak royal authority and noble dominance continued. Louis II came of age in a world that was rapidly changing. The Protestant Reformation had begun in Germany, with Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church in 1517. The ideas of Luther and other reformers spread quickly, finding a receptive audience in Bohemia, where the Hussite tradition had prepared the ground for religious dissent. But the greatest challenge facing Louis was not religious but military. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was expanding aggressively into Central Europe. Hungary, which Louis also ruled, lay directly in the path of Ottoman expansion. In 1526, Suleiman launched a massive invasion of Hungary. Louis gathered what forces he could and marched to meet the Ottomans. The two armies met at the Battle of Mohacs on August 29, 1526. The battle was a catastrophe for Hungary. The Hungarian army was utterly destroyed, and Louis himself was killed, drowning in a swamp while fleeing the battlefield. He was only 20 years old and left no children. The death of Louis II at Mohacs was one of the pivotal moments in Central European history. It ended the Jagiellon rule in Bohemia and Hungary and opened the door for a new dynasty to take control of both kingdoms. That dynasty was the Habsburgs. Ferdinand of Habsburg was the brother-in-law of Louis, married to Louis's sister, Anna. He claimed the crowns of both Bohemia and Hungary based on this connection and on earlier agreements between the Habsburg and Jagiellon families. In Bohemia, Ferdinand's claim was accepted relatively smoothly. The Bohemian estates elected him king in October 1526, just 2 months after Mohacs. They hoped that Ferdinand, backed by the resources of the Habsburg lands in Austria and Spain, would be able to protect them from the Ottoman threat. Hungary was more complicated. Part of the country accepted Ferdinand, but another part elected a native Hungarian nobleman, John Zápolya, as king. This division would lead to decades of conflict and would eventually result in Hungary being split 3 ways, with the Habsburgs controlling the west, the Ottomans controlling the centre, and Transylvania maintaining a precarious independence in the east. Ferdinand I began the Habsburg rule of Bohemia that would last, with one brief interruption, until 1918. The Habsburgs would transform Bohemia for better and for worse over the nearly 4 centuries of their rule. Ferdinand was a very different kind of ruler than the weak Jagiellon kings. He was determined to strengthen royal authority and to bring Bohemia more firmly under his control. He was also a devout Catholic who viewed the religious diversity of Bohemia with suspicion. Ferdinand began to chip away at the privileges of the Bohemian estates. He appointed royal officials to positions that had previously been filled by the estates. He tried to limit the autonomy of the towns. He worked to strengthen the Catholic Church at the expense of the Utraquists and other Protestant groups. But Ferdinand also faced constraints. He needed the cooperation of the Bohemian estates to raise taxes and troops for his wars against the Ottomans. He could not simply impose his will by force. The result was a constant negotiation between the king and the estates, with each side trying to gain advantage over the other. The religious situation grew more complex as the Protestant Reformation spread. Lutheran ideas found followers in Bohemia, particularly among the German-speaking population. Calvinist ideas also gained ground, especially among the nobility. The old Utraquist church found itself squeezed between resurgent Catholicism and the new Protestant movements. Ferdinand tried to promote Catholic renewal through the Jesuits, the new religious order founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits established schools and colleges in Bohemia, educating the sons of the nobility in Catholic faith and Habsburg loyalty. They were effective missionaries, winning converts and strengthening the Catholic position. But Ferdinand could not eliminate Protestantism in Bohemia. The nobility was too powerful, and too many of them were Protestants. The best he could do was contain the Protestant advance and prepare the ground for future efforts at re-Catholicization. Ferdinand died in 1564, having ruled Bohemia for nearly 40 years. He had established Habsburg authority in the kingdom and had begun the long process of strengthening royal power at the expense of the estates. But he had not resolved the religious tensions that continued to simmer beneath the surface. His successors, Maximilian II and Rudolf II, would continue his policies with varying degrees of success. The religious question would remain unresolved, a source of constant tension that would eventually explode into one of the most destructive wars in European history. The Jagiellon era and the early Habsburg period were a time of transition for Bohemia. The kingdom lost the independence it had enjoyed under the Psammislids and Luxembourgs, becoming part of a larger Habsburg realm. The power of the crown declined, and the nobility grew stronger. The religious landscape became ever more complex, with Catholics, Utraquists, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Bohemian Brethren all competing for followers. Yet Bohemia remained a distinct kingdom with its own laws, its own estates, and its own identity. The Bohemian crown was one of the most prestigious in Europe, and the Bohemian king was still one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. The kingdom had survived the Hussite Wars, the Ottoman threat, and the extinction of multiple dynasties. It would survive the challenges to come, though not without great suffering. The late 16th century brought one of the most unusual rulers in European history to the Bohemian throne. Rudolf II, who became king in 1576 and Holy Roman Emperor in the same year, was unlike any monarch Bohemia had known. He was a man of extraordinary intellectual curiosity, deep melancholy, and increasing eccentricity. His reign would be remembered as a time of cultural brilliance and political dysfunction. Rudolf made a decision that delighted the people of Prague and transformed their city. He moved the imperial court from Vienna to Prague, making the Bohemian capital once again the centre of the Holy Roman Empire. For the first time since Charles IV, the King of Bohemia and the Emperor resided in Prague Castle, and the city experienced a renaissance of culture and learning. Rudolf was a passionate collector. He assembled one of the most remarkable collections of art curiosities and scientific instruments in Europe. His Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, contained paintings by the greatest masters, sculptures ancient and modern, astronomical instruments, exotic animals, and objects from around the world. It was a microcosm of the universe, reflecting Rudolph's desire to understand and possess all of creation. The emperor was fascinated by science and the occult, which in his time were not clearly distinguished from each other. He patronized astronomers, alchemists, and scholars of all kinds. His court became a gathering place for some of the greatest minds of the age. Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer who made the most accurate observations of the stars and planets before the invention of the telescope, came to Prague at Rudolph's invitation. Brahe built an observatory and continued his work under imperial patronage until his death in 1601. Johannes Kepler, who would discover the laws of planetary motion, succeeded Brahe as imperial mathematician. Working with Brahe's observations, Kepler made the breakthrough that planets move in ellipses rather than circles, a discovery that would revolutionize astronomy and lay the groundwork for Newton's physics. Alchemists flocked to Prague, hoping to win Rudolph's favor by discovering the philosopher's stone or the secret of transmuting base metals into gold. Most were charlatans, but some were serious investigators who contributed to the development of chemistry. Rudolph himself spent hours in his laboratory, pursuing the secrets of nature. The emperor also patronized artists. Giuseppe Arcimboldo created his famous composite portraits at Rudolph's court, paintings in which human faces are composed of fruits, vegetables, flowers, or other objects. These strange and wonderful images reflected the playful, curious spirit of Rudolph's court. But Rudolph's intellectual pursuits came at the cost of effective government. He was increasingly withdrawn, spending his time with his collections and his studies rather than attending to the business of ruling. He suffered from depression and possibly other mental illnesses. He never married and had no legitimate children, creating uncertainty about the succession. The religious situation in Bohemia grew increasingly tense during Rudolph's reign. The Protestant nobility had grown powerful, and they demanded guarantees of their religious freedom. Rudolph, though personally inclined toward tolerance, was under pressure from Catholic hardliners within the Habsburg family and the church hierarchy. In 1609, the Protestant estates forced Rudolph to issue the Letter of Majesty, one of the most important documents in Bohemian history. This decree guaranteed freedom of religion to the Bohemian estates, allowing Protestants to build churches, establish schools, and practice their faith without interference. It was a remarkable concession, granting Bohemia a degree of religious tolerance that was rare in early 17th century Europe. The Letter of Majesty was won through pressure and negotiation, not through Rudolph's genuine commitment to tolerance. The Protestant estates had taken advantage of a conflict between Rudolph and his brother Matthias, who was challenging Rudolph's authority. Rudolph granted the Letter of Majesty to win Protestant support against Matthias, but the victory was short-lived. Matthias eventually forced Rudolph to cede control of Hungary, Austria, and Moravia, leaving him only the Bohemian crown. Rudolph died in 1612, a broken and isolated man, and Matthias became King of Bohemia as well as Emperor. Matthias was already an old man when he took full control, and he had no children. The question of succession loomed over his reign. The Habsburg family decided that the next king should be Ferdinand of Styria, a cousin who was known for his fervent Catholicism and his determination to eliminate Protestantism from his lands. Ferdinand had already demonstrated his commitment to the Counter-Reformation in his own territories. He had expelled Protestant preachers, closed Protestant churches, and forced his subjects to convert to Catholicism or leave. The Bohemian Protestants viewed his prospective succession with alarm, In 1617, Matthias persuaded the Bohemian estates to accept Ferdinand as the heir to the Bohemian throne. Many Protestants reluctantly agreed, hoping that Ferdinand would respect the Letter of Majesty once he became king. They would be bitterly disappointed. Even before Matthias died, tensions began to rise. Ferdinand's supporters, who now controlled the royal government in Prague, began to restrict Protestant rights. They halted the construction of Protestant churches on royal lands, arguing that the Letter of Majesty did not apply to such territories. They appointed Catholics to key positions and showed favour to the Catholic minority. The Protestant estates protested, but their complaints were ignored. They appealed to Matthias, but the ageing emperor was unable or unwilling to intervene. The situation grew more volatile with each passing month. The crisis came to a head in May 1618. Protestant leaders called a meeting of the estates to address their grievances. On May 23rd, a group of Protestant nobles marched to Prague Castle to confront the royal governors who had been enforcing the anti-Protestant policies. The confrontation took place in the Bohemian Chancellery, a room in the castle where the royal administration conducted its business. The Protestant nobles accused the governors, Jaroslav Bošita of Martinice and Vilém Slavata of Chlum, of violating the Letter of Majesty and betraying the liberties of the Bohemian kingdom. The atmosphere was charged with anger and fear. What happened next would echo through the centuries. The Protestant nobles seized the two governors and their secretary, Philip Fabricius, and threw them out of the window of the Chancellery. The drop was considerable, perhaps 17 metres or more, into the dry moat below the castle walls. Remarkably, all three men survived the fall. Catholics attributed their survival to the intervention of the Virgin Mary, who had miraculously cushioned their landing. Protestants offered a more earthly explanation, noting that the moat was filled with refuse and garbage that had broken their fall. Whatever the truth, the three men escaped with their lives, though Slavata was badly injured. This event is known as the Second Defenestration of Prague, echoing the First Defenestration that had sparked the Hussite Wars 2 centuries earlier. Like its predecessor, the Second Defenestration marked the beginning of a catastrophic conflict. But this time, the war would not be confined to Bohemia. It would engulf all of Europe in what became known as the 30 Years' War. The Defenestration was an act of rebellion against Habsburg authority. The Protestant nobles knew that there could be no going back. They had committed treason against their king, and they would have to see the rebellion through to victory or face the consequences of defeat. The Bohemian estates moved quickly to organise their resistance. They established a provisional government, raised an army, and sought allies among the Protestant powers of Europe. They declared that Ferdinand, who was not yet officially King of Bohemia, had forfeited his right to the throne through his violations of Bohemian liberties. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was dealing with the death of Emperor Matthias in March 1619. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor in August of that year, becoming Ferdinand II. But even as he assumed the imperial title, he faced rebellion in Bohemia and the prospect of losing one of his most important crowns. The Bohemian estates decided to elect a new king. Their choice fell on Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, a young German prince who was the leader of the Protestant Union and the son-in-law of King James I of England. Frederick was handsome, charming, and Protestant. He seemed like the perfect candidate to lead Bohemia's struggle for religious freedom. Frederick accepted the Bohemian crown and travelled to Prague with his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, for a coronation in November 1619. The couple was young and optimistic, believing that the Protestant powers of Europe would rally to their cause. They expected support from England, from the Dutch Republic, from the German Protestant princes. They were wrong. King James of England, despite being Frederick's father-in-law, refused to involve himself in what he saw as a reckless adventure. The Dutch were preoccupied with their own struggles against Spain. The German Protestant princes were divided and hesitant. Frederick and Elizabeth found themselves largely alone, facing the combined might of the Habsburg Empire and its Catholic allies. Ferdinand II was not a man to accept the loss of Bohemia. He gathered his forces, called upon his allies in Spain and Bavaria, and prepared to crush the rebellion. The Catholic League, led by Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, provided a well-trained army under the command of the experienced General Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly. The decisive confrontation came on November 8, 1620, at a place called White Mountain, just outside Prague. The Battle of White Mountain, or Bila Hora in Czech, lasted only about 2 hours, but it determined the fate of Bohemia for the next 3 centuries. The Bohemian army was poorly led and badly positioned. Many of the soldiers were mercenaries with little commitment to the cause. When Tilly's forces attacked, the Bohemian lines crumbled. The rout was complete. Thousands of Bohemian soldiers were killed or captured, and the army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Frederick and Elizabeth fled Prague the day after the battle, abandoning their kingdom after barely a year on the throne. Frederick became known mockingly as the Winter King, a ruler whose reign had lasted only 1 winter. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, dying in 1632 without ever recovering his lands or his dignity. The defeat at White Mountain was catastrophic for Bohemia. Ferdinand moved quickly to punish the rebels and to ensure that such a rebellion could never happen again. His vengeance was thorough and systematic. On June 21, 1621, 27 leaders of the rebellion were executed in the Old Town Square of Prague. The executions were carried out with deliberate cruelty, designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying Habsburg authority. Some were beheaded, others were hanged, and some suffered both. Their heads were displayed on the tower of the Charles Bridge as a warning to others. The executions were only the beginning. Ferdinand confiscated the estates of the rebel nobles, transferring vast amounts of property from Protestant to Catholic hands. Many noble families that had dominated Bohemian politics for generations were ruined overnight. Their lands were given to loyal Catholics, many of them foreigners who had supported Ferdinand during the rebellion. The religious transformation was equally dramatic. Ferdinand was determined to restore Bohemia to the Catholic faith, and he pursued this goal with relentless determination. Protestant churches were closed or converted to Catholic use. Protestant ministers were expelled from the kingdom. The Letter of Majesty was revoked, and Protestantism was effectively outlawed. The Jesuits played a central role in the re-Catholicization of Bohemia. They established schools and colleges, educating the next generation of Bohemians in the Catholic faith. They preached, they heard confessions, they organized missions to the countryside. They were patient and persistent, understanding that the conversion of Bohemia would take time. For those who refused to convert, the choices were stark. They could submit to the Catholic Church, they could leave Bohemia, or they could practice their faith in secret at the risk of severe punishment. Many chose exile, abandoning their homeland for Protestant territories in Germany, the Netherlands, or elsewhere. The most famous of these exiles was Jan Amos Komensky, known in Latin as Comenius. He was a bishop of the Unity of Brethren and one of the greatest educational thinkers of his age. Comenius spent his life in exile, moving from country to country, writing works on education and philosophy that would influence thinkers for centuries. He never returned to Bohemia, dying in Amsterdam in 1670, but he never forgot his homeland or abandoned hope for its liberation. The renewed land ordinance of 1627 formalised the new order in Bohemia. This constitutional document stripped the estates of most of their powers and concentrated authority in the hands of the king. The Bohemian throne, which had been elective, became hereditary in the Habsburg line. The German language was given equal status with Czech in official documents, beginning a process of Germanization that would continue for centuries. Bohemia was transformed from a kingdom with significant autonomy and religious diversity into a province of the Habsburg Empire, Catholic in religion and subordinate in politics. The proud tradition of Bohemian independence, stretching back to the Przemyslids and reinforced by the Hussites, was crushed. The human cost was enormous. The 30 Years' War, which continued until 1648, devastated Bohemia. Armies marched back and forth across the land, plundering, burning, and killing. Plague and famine followed in the wake of the soldiers. The population of Bohemia may have declined by a third or more during the war years. When the Peace of Westphalia finally ended the war in 1648, Bohemia was a shadow of its former self. Its Protestant population had been expelled or forcibly converted. Its native nobility had been replaced by foreigners. Its political institutions had been gutted. Its economy was in ruins. Yet Bohemia survived. The Czech language persisted, spoken by the peasants, even as German became the language of the elite. The memory of the Hussite tradition survived, passed down through generations, even when it could not be openly expressed. The sense of Czech identity survived, dormant but not dead, waiting for a future awakening. The defeat at White Mountain became a central event in Czech historical memory. It was remembered as a national catastrophe, a moment when Bohemia lost its freedom and fell under foreign domination. For later generations of Czech nationalists, White Mountain symbolized everything they were fighting against, and the hope of overcoming its legacy motivated their struggles. The road to rebellion had led to disaster. The Bohemian Protestants had gambled everything on their uprising and had lost. Their defeat reshaped Bohemia and Central Europe for centuries to come. But the story of the Kingdom of Bohemia was not over. Even under Habsburg absolutism, Bohemia would continue to evolve, and the seeds of future change were already being planted. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 decided the fate of Bohemia, but it did not end the 30 Years' War. The conflict continued for nearly 3 more decades, spreading across Europe and drawing in powers from Spain to Sweden, from France to the Ottoman Empire. Bohemia, which had sparked the war, became one of its principal battlegrounds and one of its greatest victims. After the initial Habsburg victory, the war entered new phases as different powers intervened for their own reasons. Denmark entered the conflict in 1625, hoping to expand its influence in northern Germany and to support the Protestant cause. King Christian IV of Denmark led an army into the empire, but he was defeated by the imperial forces and forced to withdraw. The Swedish intervention beginning in 1630 was far more successful. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden was one of the great military commanders of his age, and his army was the most modern and effective in Europe. He landed in Germany with the stated goal of defending Protestant liberties against Habsburg aggression. Gustavus Adolphus won a series of stunning victories, pushing deep into the heart of the empire. His forces reached as far as Bavaria, threatening the Catholic heartland. For a moment, it seemed that the Protestant cause might be revived and that the Habsburg triumph might be reversed. But Gustavus Adolphus was killed at the Battle of Lützen in 1632, and the Swedish advance stalled. The war continued, but without the Swedish king's leadership, the Protestant side lost its momentum. The conflict degenerated into a grinding war of attrition. with armies crisscrossing Germany and causing immense destruction. France, though a Catholic country, entered the war against the Habsburgs in 1635. The French were motivated not by religion, but by politics. They feared Habsburg domination of Europe and sought to weaken their rivals by prolonging the conflict. French intervention ensured that the war would continue for another 13 years. Throughout these decades of warfare, Bohemia suffered terribly. The kingdom was occupied by various armies at different times, each bringing destruction and misery. Imperial forces, Swedish forces, Saxon forces, and others all passed through Bohemia, living off the land and leaving devastation in their wake. The city of Prague itself was attacked multiple times. In 1631, Saxon forces allied with the Swedes briefly occupied the city, raising hopes among the remaining Protestants that their fortunes might be reversed. But the Saxons withdrew, and the hopes were dashed. In 1648, in the final days of the war, Swedish forces attacked Prague again, capturing the lesser town and Hradčany, but failing to take the old town across the river. The rural areas suffered even more than the cities. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and livestock was slaughtered or driven off. Peasants fled to the forests or to fortified towns, abandoning their fields. Famine became widespread as agricultural production collapsed. Disease followed famine, with plague and other epidemics sweeping through the weakened population. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Historians estimate that Bohemia lost between a third and a half of its population during the 30 Years' War. Some regions were almost completely depopulated. It would take generations for the kingdom to recover from this devastation. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 finally ended the war. The treaties signed at Münster and Osnabrück reshaped the political and religious map of Europe. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, was reaffirmed, meaning that rulers could determine the religion of their territories. The independence of the Dutch Republic and the Swiss Confederation was recognised. The power of the Holy Roman Emperor was further weakened, with the individual German states gaining greater autonomy. For Bohemia, the Peace of Westphalia brought no relief. The treaties confirmed the Habsburg victory and the re-Catholicization of the kingdom. The exiled Protestants were not allowed to return. The confiscated estates were not restored. The renewed land ordinance remained in force. Bohemia's subordination to Habsburg authority was complete. The decades following the Peace of Westphalia were a time of slow recovery and profound transformation. The old Bohemia, with its religious diversity, its powerful estates, and its tradition of independence, was gone. A new Bohemia was emerging, Catholic in faith, absolutist in politics, and increasingly German in its elite culture. The Catholic Church consolidated its hold on Bohemian society. New churches and monasteries were built, many in the exuberant Baroque style that became characteristic of the Counter-Reformation. The landscape of Bohemia was transformed by Baroque architecture, with ornate churches, elaborate palaces, and grand public buildings rising across the kingdom. Prague was rebuilt and beautified. The Baroque style left its mark on the city, with new churches, palaces, and gardens complementing the Gothic and Renaissance structures that had survived the war. The Church of St. Nicholas in the lesser town, completed in the 18th century, became one of the finest Baroque churches in Central Europe. The nobility that now dominated Bohemia was largely new, having acquired their estates through confiscation after White Mountain. Many of these families were not Czech, but German, Italian, Spanish, or from other parts of the Habsburg Empire. They built grand palaces in Prague and country estates across Bohemia, living in a style that reflected their wealth and power. The Czech language declined in prestige and use among the upper classes. German became the language of the court, the administration, and polite society. Czech survived among the peasants and the lower urban classes, but it was increasingly seen as a rustic tongue, unsuitable for educated discourse. Yet the Czech identity did not disappear. The peasants who worked the fields continued to speak Czech, to tell Czech stories, and to maintain Czech traditions. The parish priests who ministered to them often spoke Czech as well, even as the church hierarchy conducted its business in Latin and German. The seeds of a future national revival were preserved in the humble soil of village life. The Habsburg monarchy itself was evolving during this period. The various Habsburg lands, including Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and others, were becoming more integrated into a single administrative system. The particularism of the individual kingdoms was gradually eroded as the Habsburgs built a more centralized state. This centralization accelerated under Emperor Leopold I, who ruled from 1658 to 1705. Leopold faced enormous challenges, including a major Ottoman invasion that reached the gates of Vienna in 1683. The successful defence of Vienna and the subsequent reconquest of Hungary from the Ottomans transformed the Habsburg Empire, making it a major European power. Bohemia contributed to these imperial enterprises through taxes and soldiers. The kingdom's resources were mobilized for wars that served Habsburg interests rather than specifically Bohemian ones. Bohemia was becoming a component of a larger whole, its identity submerged in the broader Habsburg system. The early 18th century brought new conflicts. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, pitted the Habsburgs against France and Spain over the inheritance of the Spanish throne. Bohemia was not a major theatre of this war, but it contributed to the Habsburg war effort and felt the economic strain of prolonged conflict. The death of Emperor Charles VI in 1740 created a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for Bohemia. Charles had no sons, and he had spent much of his reign trying to secure the succession for his daughter, Maria Theresa. He issued a document called the Pragmatic Sanction, which declared that the Habsburg lands were indivisible and could pass to a female heir. Despite these preparations, Maria Theresa's succession was immediately challenged. Frederick II of Prussia, seeing an opportunity to expand his kingdom at Habsburg expense, invaded Silesia, a wealthy province that had been part of the Bohemian crown for centuries. The War of the Austrian Succession had begun. Maria Theresa fought to defend her inheritance, but she could not save Silesia. The province, with its valuable industries and substantial population, was lost to Prussia. This was a severe blow to the Bohemian crown, which had included Silesia since the 14th century. The loss would never be reversed, and Silesia would remain part of Prussia and later Germany until the 20th century. The war also brought foreign occupation to Bohemia itself. In 1741, a coalition of France, Bavaria and Saxony invaded the kingdom. Bavarian and French forces occupied Prague, and the Elector of Bavaria was crowned King of Bohemia in St. Vitus Cathedral. For a moment it seemed that Habsburg rule in Bohemia might end. But Maria Theresa rallied her forces. She appealed to the Hungarian nobility for support, famously appearing before them with her infant son and winning their loyalty. Habsburg armies recaptured Prague in 1743, and the Bavarian king was driven out. The Habsburg hold on Bohemia was restored. Maria Theresa drew lessons from these crises. She embarked on a program of reform designed to strengthen the Habsburg state and prevent future disasters. Her reforms touched every aspect of government, from the military to the administration to the economy. For Bohemia, Maria Theresa's reforms meant further centralization. The Bohemian Chancellery, which had managed the kingdom's affairs, was merged with the Austrian Chancellery. The distinction between the Bohemian and Austrian lands was blurred as common institutions were created to govern them both. Maria Theresa also reformed the condition of the peasantry. She limited the labour services that lords could demand from their peasants and provided some legal protections against the worst abuses. These reforms did not end serfdom, but they began a process of gradual improvement that would continue under her successors. The Empress was a devout Catholic, and she had little sympathy for religious diversity. She persecuted the remaining Protestants in Bohemia, forcing them to convert or driving them underground. She also imposed restrictions on the Jewish population, though these were later relaxed. Maria Theresa ruled until 1780, a reign of 40 years that transformed the Habsburg Empire. She was succeeded by her son, Joseph II, who would take the reform program even further. Joseph II was an enlightened absolutist, influenced by the rationalist philosophy of the Enlightenment. He believed that a strong centralized state, guided by reason, could improve the lives of its subjects. He implemented reforms at a dizzying pace, often without regard for tradition or the sensibilities of his subjects. For Bohemia, Joseph's most important reform was the abolition of serfdom in 1781. The patent of serfdom freed the peasants from their bondage to the land, allowing them to move, marry, and choose their occupations without the permission of their lords. This was a revolutionary change, transforming the social structure of the kingdom. Joseph also issued the Edict of Toleration in 1781, granting freedom of worship to Protestants and Orthodox Christians. For the first time since the Counter-Reformation, Protestants could legally practice their faith in Bohemia. Many families who had maintained their Protestant beliefs in secret for generations now openly declared their faith. The emperor reformed the Catholic Church as well, closing hundreds of monasteries that he deemed unproductive and redirecting their resources to parishes and schools. He reduced the power of the Pope over the Church in his lands and asserted state control over religious affairs. Joseph's reforms extended to language and culture. He made German the sole official language of the Habsburg administration, displacing Latin and the various vernacular languages. This was intended to create a more efficient bureaucracy, but it had the effect of marginalizing non-German languages, including Czech. The Germanization policy provoked resentment among Czech speakers, who saw their language being pushed out of public life. This resentment would contribute to the Czech national awakening that would emerge in the following decades. Joseph II died in 1790, exhausted by his own reforming zeal. His brother Leopold II succeeded him, but ruled only 2 years. The Habsburg Empire then passed to Leopold's son, Francis II, who would face the greatest challenge in the empire's history, the French Revolution and Napoleon. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that convulsed Europe from 1792 to 1815 had relatively limited direct impact on Bohemia. The kingdom was not a major battlefield, though it contributed soldiers and resources to the Habsburg war effort. Napoleon never occupied Prague, though his armies came close. The end of the Napoleonic era brought a conservative reaction across Europe. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 restored the old order, or attempted to, and the Habsburg Empire entered a period of political stagnation under the guidance of Prince Metternich. Reform was suppressed, and any expression of nationalism or liberalism was viewed with suspicion. Yet beneath the surface of Metternich's repressive system, change was stirring. The Czech national revival was beginning, a cultural and eventually political movement that would seek to restore the Czech language and identity to their rightful place. The seeds planted during the dark centuries after White Mountain were beginning to sprout. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War had transformed Bohemia beyond recognition. The kingdom that had defied the Habsburgs in 1618 had been crushed, recatholicized, and absorbed into a centralized imperial system. But the Czech people had survived, their language and identity preserved by the peasants and the priests who had kept them alive through generations of foreign domination. The 18th century was a time of profound transformation for Bohemia, though much of this transformation was imposed from above rather than arising from within. The Habsburg monarchs, particularly Maria Theresa and Joseph II, reshaped the kingdom through their reform programs, seeking to create a more efficient, rational, and centralized state. Their efforts brought significant changes to Bohemian society, economy, and culture, laying the groundwork for the developments of the 19th century. Maria Theresa came to the throne in 1740 under the most difficult circumstances. Her father, Charles VI, had spent years trying to secure her succession through the Pragmatic Sanction, but his death immediately triggered a war as rival powers sought to dismember the Habsburg inheritance. The young empress, only 23 years old, found herself fighting for her throne and her lands. The War of the Austrian Succession lasted 8 years and ended with mixed results for the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa kept most of her inheritance, but she lost Silesia to Prussia. This loss was a bitter blow, both economically and symbolically. Silesia had been one of the wealthiest provinces of the Bohemian crown, and its seizure by Frederick II of Prussia was a humiliation that Maria Theresa never forgot. The Empress was determined to learn from this defeat. She recognized that the Habsburg state needed fundamental reform if it was to survive in a world of aggressive, modernizing powers like Prussia. She gathered around her a group of talented advisors and embarked on a comprehensive program of reform. The military was the first priority. Maria Theresa reformed the army, improving its training, equipment, and organization. She established military academies to produce professional officers. She increased the size of the standing army and created a more reliable system for recruiting and supplying soldiers. The administration was reformed as well. Maria Theresa centralized government functions that had previously been dispersed among the various Habsburg lands. The Bohemian and Austrian chancelleries were merged, creating a unified administrative system for the core Habsburg territories. New agencies were created to manage specific functions like commerce and finance. The tax system was overhauled to provide more reliable revenue. Maria Theresa imposed new taxes on the nobility, who had previously been largely exempt from taxation. She conducted surveys of land and population to create a more accurate basis for assessment. These reforms increased the state's income and reduced its dependence on the goodwill of the estates. Education received particular attention. Maria Theresa believed that an educated population was essential for a strong state. She established a system of compulsory primary education, requiring all children to attend school. New schools were built across Bohemia and the other Habsburg lands, staffed by teachers trained in state-approved methods. The Empress also reformed the universities, bringing them under closer state control and modernizing their curricula. The influence of the Jesuits, who had dominated higher education since the Counter-Reformation, was reduced. When the Pope dissolved the Jesuit order in 1773, Maria Theresa seized the opportunity to reorganize education along more secular lines. The condition of the peasantry was another focus of reform. Maria Theresa was genuinely concerned about the welfare of her humblest subjects, and she recognized that a prosperous peasantry was essential for a strong state. She issued regulations limiting the labour services that lords could demand from their peasants and providing some legal protections against arbitrary treatment. These reforms did not end serfdom or fundamentally alter the relationship between lords and peasants. The nobility retained enormous power over the rural population. But the reforms began a process of gradual improvement that would continue under Maria Theresa's successors. The Empress was a devout Catholic, and her religious policies reflected her faith. She continued the Counter-Reformation's work of suppressing Protestantism, though with somewhat less vigour than her predecessors. She imposed restrictions on Jews, limiting where they could live and what occupations they could pursue. She was suspicious of new ideas that seemed to challenge traditional religion and morality. Yet Maria Theresa was also a pragmatist. She recognized that religious persecution could be economically harmful, driving away skilled workers and merchants. She tolerated a degree of quiet nonconformity as long as it did not openly challenge the established order. Her policies were repressive by modern standards, but moderate by the standards of her time. Maria Theresa ruled for 40 years, dying in 1780. She had transformed the Habsburg state, making it stronger, more centralized, and more efficient. She had survived the crisis of the Austrian succession and had rebuilt Habsburg power after the loss of Silesia. She was mourned throughout her lands as a mother figure who had cared for her subjects' welfare. Her son and successor, Joseph II, shared her commitment to reform, but pursued it with far greater radicalism. Joseph was an enlightened absolutist, influenced by the rationalist philosophy that dominated European intellectual life in the late 18th century. He believed that reason could solve all problems, and that a strong monarch, guided by reason, could transform society for the better. Joseph had served as co-regent with his mother during the last 15 years of her reign, but Maria Theresa had kept him on a tight leash, blocking his more radical proposals. When she died, Joseph was finally free to implement his vision. The pace of reform under Joseph was breathtaking. In his 10 years as sole ruler, he issued over 6,000 decrees, touching every aspect of life in the Habsburg lands. He worked obsessively, often late into the night, driving himself and his officials to exhaustion. The abolition of serfdom was Joseph's most far-reaching reform. The Patent of Serfdom, issued in 1781, freed the peasants from their bondage to the land. They could now move freely, marry without their lord's permission, and choose their own occupations. They were still required to pay dues and perform some labour services for their lords, but they were no longer legally tied to the soil. This reform transformed rural society in Bohemia. Peasants who had been bound to their villages for generations could now seek opportunities elsewhere. Some moved to the growing towns and cities, providing labour for the emerging industries. Others remained on the land, but with a new sense of dignity and possibility. The Edict of Toleration, also issued in 1781, granted freedom of worship to Protestants and Orthodox Christians. This was a revolutionary change in a land where Protestantism had been suppressed for over a century and a half. Thousands of Bohemians who had secretly maintained their Protestant faith now declared it openly, building churches and organising congregations. The toleration extended to Jews as well, though with more limitations. Joseph removed some of the restrictions on Jewish residence and occupation, allowing Jews to enter trades and professions that had previously been closed to them. He also required Jews to adopt German surnames and to send their children to German language schools. part of his broader policy of cultural assimilation. Joseph reformed the Catholic Church with the same rationalist zeal he applied to everything else. He closed hundreds of monasteries and convents that he deemed unproductive, redirecting their resources to parishes, schools, and charitable institutions. He reduced the power of the Pope over the Church in his lands, asserting state control over ecclesiastical appointments and regulations. The emperor even intervened in matters of worship and devotion. He banned certain popular religious practices that he considered superstitious, such as elaborate pilgrimages and the veneration of certain relics. He simplified church services and reduced the number of holy days. These reforms provoked resentment among devout Catholics, who saw them as attacks on their faith. Joseph's language policy was particularly significant for Bohemia. He made German the sole official language of the Habsburg administration, replacing Latin and the various vernacular languages that had been used in different regions. All government business was to be conducted in German, and officials were required to be fluent in the language. This policy was intended to create a more efficient administration by establishing a common language for the entire empire, but it had profound cultural implications. Czech, which had already declined in prestige since the Counter-Reformation, was further marginalized. German became the language of advancement, and ambitious Czechs had to master it to succeed in government, business, or the professions. The Germanization policy provoked a backlash that would have lasting consequences. Czech intellectuals began to defend their language and culture against what they saw as German cultural imperialism. They collected Czech folk songs and stories, compiled dictionaries and grammars, and wrote works celebrating Czech history and identity. This was the beginning of the Czech national revival, a movement that would grow throughout the 19th century. Joseph II died in 1790, worn out by his own relentless activity. His epitaph, which he reportedly composed himself, read, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in everything he undertook." This was too harsh a judgment. Many of Joseph's reforms endured and had lasting positive effects, but his methods had created enormous resentment, and his successor, Leopold II, had to spend his brief reign calming the unrest Joseph had provoked. Leopold died in 1792, and the Habsburg throne passed to his son Francis. Francis would rule for over 40 years, but his reign was dominated by the great crisis of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, sent shockwaves across Europe. The revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity challenged the foundations of the old order. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 horrified the monarchs of Europe and convinced them that the revolution must be destroyed. The Habsburg Empire joined the coalition of powers fighting against revolutionary France. The wars that followed lasted, with brief interruptions, for over 2 decades. They transformed the map of Europe and eventually brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power as Emperor of the French. Napoleon's armies won victory after victory against the Habsburgs and their allies. In 1805, Napoleon crushed the Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz, fought in Moravia not far from the Bohemian border. This defeat forced Francis to accept a humiliating peace and to give up the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which had been held by the Habsburgs for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient and unwieldy structure that had shaped European politics for over 800 years, ceased to exist in 1806. Francis retained his other titles, including King of Bohemia, and he created a new title, Emperor of Austria, to maintain his imperial dignity. But the end of the Holy Roman Empire marked the close of an era. Bohemia was not directly occupied by Napoleon's forces, but the kingdom felt the effects of the wars. Bohemian soldiers fought in the Habsburg armies, and Bohemian resources were mobilized for the war effort. The economic disruption caused by years of conflict affected trade and industry. The final defeat of Napoleon in 1815 brought peace to Europe and allowed the old order to reassert itself. The Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's fall, was dominated by Prince Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister who would shape Habsburg policy for the next 3 decades. Metternich was deeply conservative, committed to preserving the existing order against the forces of liberalism and nationalism that the French Revolution had unleashed. He created a system of repression designed to suppress any expression of revolutionary ideas. Censorship was strict, political activity was monitored, and dissent was punished. Under Metternich's system, Bohemia experienced political stagnation. The reforms of Maria Theresa and Joseph II were not reversed, but further reform was blocked. The estates, which had lost most of their power under the centralizing monarchs, were not restored to influence. The kingdom was governed by bureaucrats appointed from Vienna, with little input from the Bohemian population. Yet beneath the surface of Metternich's repressive system, change was stirring. The Czech national revival, which had begun as a cultural movement in response to Joseph's Germanization policies, was gaining strength. Czech intellectuals were rediscovering their language and history, laying the groundwork for a political movement that would emerge later in the century. The economic transformation of Bohemia was also underway. The kingdom was becoming one of the most industrialized regions of the Habsburg Empire. Textile mills, glassworks, and other industries were established, drawing workers from the countryside to the growing towns. A new middle class of businessmen, professionals, and skilled workers was emerging, with interests and attitudes different from the traditional nobility and peasantry. The Habsburg absolutism of the 18th century had transformed Bohemia in profound ways. The reforms of Maria Theresa and Joseph II had modernized the state, freed the peasants, and established religious toleration. But these reforms had also centralized power in Vienna, marginalized the Czech language, and subordinated Bohemia's distinct identity to the broader Habsburg system. The 19th century would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The forces of nationalism and liberalism that Metternich struggled to contain would eventually break free, transforming Bohemia and all of Europe. The Kingdom of Bohemia would face its final century, a century of national awakening, revolutionary upheaval, and ultimately the end of the kingdom itself. The seeds of change had been planted during the reign of Joseph II. His Germanization policies, intended to create administrative efficiency, had provoked a defensive reaction among Czech intellectuals. They began to study and celebrate the Czech language, to collect folk traditions, and to write histories that emphasized Bohemia's distinct identity. This was the beginning of the Czech national revival, one of the most remarkable cultural movements in European history. The early leaders of the revival were scholars and writers who worked to demonstrate that Czech was a language worthy of respect, capable of expressing the highest thoughts and the finest literature. They faced an uphill battle. Czech had declined so far in prestige that many educated Bohemians could barely speak it. German was the language of culture, commerce, and government. Czech was associated with peasants and servants. Joseph Dubrovsky was one of the founding figures of the revival. He was a priest and scholar who devoted his life to the study of the Czech language and its history. His Czech grammar, published in 1809, established the foundations for the modern literary language. His historical works traced the development of Czech literature from its medieval origins. Dubrovsky himself was skeptical that Czech could be fully revived as a literary language, but his scholarly work provided the tools that others would use to prove him wrong. Joseph Jungmann took up where Dąbrowski left off. He was determined to show that Czech could express any idea, no matter how complex or sophisticated. He compiled a massive Czech-German dictionary that took decades to complete. He translated major works of world literature into Czech, demonstrating the language's flexibility and richness. He wrote original works in Czech on history, aesthetics, and other subjects. Jungmann and his circle faced a practical problem. The Czech language had been neglected for so long that it lacked vocabulary for many modern concepts. They solved this problem by creating new words, drawing on old Czech roots, borrowing from other Slavic languages, and inventing terms as needed. Many of the words they created are still used in Czech today. The revival was not only linguistic but also historical. Czech historians began to write accounts of Bohemian history that emphasized the kingdom's achievements and its struggles for independence. They celebrated the Hussite movement as a precursor of the Protestant Reformation and a demonstration of Czech courage and conviction. They mourned the defeat at White Mountain as a national catastrophe that had robbed Bohemia of its freedom. František Palacký became the greatest of these historians. His monumental history of the Czech nation in Bohemia and Moravia, published in multiple volumes over several decades, became the foundational text of Czech national consciousness. Palacký portrayed Czech history as a continuous struggle between the Czech nation and German domination, with the Hussite period representing the highest expression of Czech national spirit. Palacky's interpretation of history was influential but also controversial. It emphasized conflict between Czechs and Germans, portraying the two peoples as fundamentally opposed. This interpretation would shape Czech nationalism for generations, contributing to the ethnic tensions that would trouble Bohemia in the 20th century. The revival extended to music, art, and popular culture. Czech composers began to incorporate folk melodies and national themes into their works. Czech artists painted scenes from national history and legend. Czech theatres performed plays in the Czech language, giving audiences the experience of hearing their mother tongue on the stage. The revival was initially a cultural movement focused on language and history rather than politics. But culture and politics could not be kept separate forever. As Czechs developed a stronger sense of national identity, they began to demand political recognition as well. They wanted the Czech language to have official status. They wanted Bohemia to have greater autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. They wanted a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The opportunity for political action came in 1848, the year of revolutions. Across Europe, popular uprisings challenged the old order. In France, the monarchy was overthrown and a republic proclaimed. In the German states, liberals and nationalists demanded constitutional government and national unification. In the Habsburg Empire, the various nationalities rose up to demand their rights. The revolution reached Prague in March 1848. Crowds gathered in the streets, demanding political reforms. The Habsburg authorities, caught off guard by the speed and scale of the uprising, made concessions. They promised a constitution, freedom of the press, and other liberal reforms. For a moment, it seemed that a new era was dawning. The Czech national movement faced a crucial question. What did they want? Some Czechs were attracted to the idea of joining a unified Germany, which would be a liberal constitutional state. But most Czech leaders rejected this option. They feared that Czechs would be swallowed up in a German-dominated nation, losing their distinct identity. František Palacký articulated the Czech position in a famous letter. He was invited to participate in the Frankfurt Parliament, which was attempting to create a unified German state. Palacký declined, writing that he was not German but Czech, and that Bohemia's future lay not with Germany, but with a reformed Habsburg Empire that would respect the rights of all its nationalities. Palecki proposed a vision of Austria as a federation of equal peoples, each with autonomy in its own affairs, but united under the Habsburg crown for common purposes. This idea of Austroslavism, as it came to be called, would influence Czech political thinking for decades. It sought to balance Czech national aspirations with the practical reality that Bohemia was part of a larger empire. In June 1848, Prague hosted a Slavic Congress, bringing together representatives of the various Slavic peoples of the Habsburg Empire. The Congress was an expression of Slavic solidarity, a demonstration that the Czechs were not alone, but part of a larger family of nations. It discussed proposals for Slavic cooperation and for the reorganization of the Habsburg Empire along federal lines. But the Congress was cut short by violence. Tensions between Czech nationalists and the German-speaking population of Prague erupted into street fighting. The Habsburg military commander, Prince Alfred Windisch-Gratz, used the unrest as a pretext to bombard the city and impose martial law. The Congress dispersed, and the revolutionary moment in Prague came to an end. The revolutions of 1848 ultimately failed across Europe. In the Habsburg Empire, the young Emperor Franz Joseph, who came to the throne in December 1848, gradually reasserted control. The promised constitution was withdrawn. The old system of centralized absolutist government was restored. The hopes of 1848 gave way to a decade of repression known as the Bach era, named after the interior minister who enforced it. Yet the revolutions had lasting effects. The peasants, who had been freed from their remaining feudal obligations during the revolutionary period, kept their freedom. The idea of constitutional government and national rights had been planted in people's minds and could not be entirely suppressed. The Czech national movement, though forced underground, continued to develop. The 1860s brought new opportunities. The Habsburg Empire suffered military defeats against France and Piedmont in 1859 and against Prussia in 1866. These defeats weakened the government and forced it to make concessions to its restive nationalities. A new constitutional system was introduced, giving the various peoples of the empire some voice in government. The most significant change came in 1867 with the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. This agreement transformed the Habsburg Empire into a dual monarchy, with Austria and Hungary as equal partners under a common sovereign. Hungary gained almost complete autonomy in its internal affairs, with its own parliament, government and laws. The Czechs watched the compromise with mixed feelings. On one hand, it demonstrated that the empire could accommodate national aspirations. On the other hand, the Czechs had not been included in the deal. Bohemia remained part of the Austrian half of the monarchy without the autonomy that Hungary had gained. Czech politicians demanded similar treatment for Bohemia. They called for a trialist solution in which Bohemia would become a third partner alongside Austria and Hungary. They pointed to Bohemia's historical status as a kingdom, its economic importance, and the size of its Czech population. But their demands were rejected. The Germans of Austria and the Hungarians both opposed any arrangement that would strengthen the Slavic peoples of the empire. The failure to achieve autonomy left Czech politicians divided over strategy. Some advocated continued pressure within the system, working through the Austrian parliament to gain incremental improvements. Others favoured passive resistance, boycotting imperial institutions to demonstrate their dissatisfaction. Still others began to look beyond the Habsburg framework entirely, imagining a future in which Bohemia might be independent or united with other Slavic peoples. Despite political frustrations, the late 19th century was a time of remarkable economic and cultural development for Bohemia. The kingdom became one of the most industrialized regions of the Habsburg Empire, second only to the areas around Vienna itself. Textile mills, engineering works, breweries, and other industries flourished. The famous Bohemian glass industry continued to produce some of the finest crystal in the world. Prague grew into a major European city. Its population expanded rapidly as people moved from the countryside to seek work in the growing industries. New neighbourhoods were built to accommodate the influx. The city's infrastructure was modernised, with gas lighting, running water, and eventually electricity. Grand public buildings were constructed, including the National Theatre, which became a symbol of Czech cultural aspirations. The National Theatre deserves special mention. It was built through public subscription, with Czechs from all walks of life contributing what they could afford. The motto inscribed on its facade, Národ sobě, meaning the nation to itself, expressed the spirit of collective effort that had made it possible. When the theatre burned down, shortly after its opening in 1881, the Czech public raised the funds to rebuild it within 2 years. Czech culture flourished in this period. Bedřich Smetana composed operas and symphonic poems that drew on Czech history and folklore, including his famous cycle Má vlast, or My Homeland. Antonín Dvořák achieved international fame with his symphonies, chamber music, and operas, bringing Czech music to audiences around the world. These composers demonstrated that Czech culture could stand alongside the great cultures of Europe. Literature also thrived. Czech writers produced novels, poetry, and drama that explored national themes and universal human experiences. Journals and newspapers in the Czech language multiplied, creating a vibrant public sphere in which ideas could be debated and opinions formed. Literacy spread as education expanded, creating an ever larger audience for Czech language publications. The relationship between Czechs and Germans in Bohemia grew more tense as the century progressed. The two communities had coexisted for centuries, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes not. But the rise of nationalism on both sides made coexistence more difficult. Czechs demanded recognition of their language and culture. Germans feared losing their privileged position. Each side increasingly saw the other as a threat. The language question was particularly contentious. Czechs demanded that their language have equal status with German in schools, courts, and government offices. Germans resisted, arguing that German was the language of culture and progress. Attempts at compromise satisfied neither side. The conflict over language became a proxy for deeper conflicts over power, identity, and the future of Bohemia. By the end of the 19th century, Bohemia was a land of contradictions. It was economically advanced but politically frustrated. It had a vibrant Czech culture, but also a substantial German minority that felt increasingly threatened. It was part of a great empire, but dreamed of autonomy or independence. These tensions would only intensify in the early 20th century, leading eventually to the dissolution of the empire and the end of the Kingdom of Bohemia. The 20th century began with Bohemia still firmly embedded in the Habsburg Empire, but the forces that would eventually tear that empire apart were already at work. Nationalism, both Czech and German, was growing more intense. The political system seemed incapable of resolving the conflicts between the empire's many peoples. And on the international stage, the great powers of Europe were drifting toward a catastrophic war. The early years of the century saw continued economic growth and cultural achievement in Bohemia. Prague was becoming a centre of modernist culture, with innovative movements in art, literature, and music. The city attracted creative talents from across the empire and beyond. Franz Kafka, though writing in German, was a product of Prague's unique cultural environment, and his works would later be recognised as among the most important of the 20th century. Czech political life was dominated by the struggle for national rights within the Habsburg system. The Young Czech Party, which had emerged in the 1870s, pursued a more assertive strategy than the older generation of Czech politicians. They demanded immediate concessions rather than patient negotiation. They organised mass demonstrations and used parliamentary obstruction to press their demands. New political movements also emerged. The Social Democrats organised the growing industrial working class, advocating for workers' rights and social reform alongside national demands. The Agrarian Party represented the interest of the rural population. Catholic parties mobilised religious voters. The political landscape became more complex and fragmented. The most significant new figure in Czech politics was Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. He was a philosopher and professor who entered politics in the 1890s. Masaryk was a critic of romantic nationalism, arguing that the Czech nation should be built on moral and democratic principles rather than ethnic sentiment. He advocated for social reform, women's rights, and honest public discourse. Masaryk was initially a voice in the wilderness, often at odds with the mainstream of Czech politics, but his moral authority and intellectual rigour gradually won him a following. He would eventually become the most important Czech political figure of the 20th century, though his greatest achievements lay in the future. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set in motion the chain of events that led to the First World War. The Habsburg Empire, allied with Germany, found itself at war with Russia, France, Britain, and eventually Italy and the United States. The war would last 4 years and would destroy the old European order. Bohemia's position in the war was complicated. The kingdom was part of the Habsburg Empire, and Bohemian soldiers were conscripted to fight for the emperor. But many Czechs had little enthusiasm for a war that seemed to serve German and Hungarian interests rather than their own. Some Czech soldiers deserted to the enemy, and Czech units were sometimes considered unreliable by Habsburg commanders. Czech political leaders faced a difficult choice. Some continued to work within the Habsburg system, hoping that loyalty during the war would be rewarded with concessions afterward. Others concluded that the empire was doomed and that Czechs should work for its destruction. Masaryk chose the path of resistance. He left the Habsburg Empire in 1914 and spent the war years abroad, working to convince the Allied powers to support the creation of an independent Czechoslovak state. He travelled to Russia, France, Britain, and the United States, meeting with political leaders and building support for his cause. Masaryk was joined in this effort by Edvard Beneš, a younger politician who became his closest collaborator, and Milan Rastislav Štefanik, a Slovak astronomer and military officer. Together, they formed the Czechoslovak National Council, which claimed to represent the Czech and Slovak peoples in their struggle for independence. The creation of Czechoslovak military units fighting alongside the Allies was crucial to their diplomatic efforts. Czech and Slovak prisoners of war and deserters from the Habsburg army were organised into legions that fought on the Russian, French and Italian fronts. The Czechoslovak Legion in Russia became particularly famous, fighting its way across Siberia during the Russian Civil War in one of the most remarkable military odysseys of the war. As the war dragged on and the Habsburg Empire weakened, the Allied powers became more receptive to the idea of breaking up the empire along national lines. The principle of national self-determination, championed by American President Woodrow Wilson, provided a moral framework for redrawing the map of Europe. By 1918, the Allies had recognized the Czechoslovak National Council as the legitimate representative of the Czech and Slovak peoples. The end came quickly. In October 1918, with the Habsburg armies collapsing and revolution spreading through the empire, the Czechoslovak National Council declared independence. On October 28, 1918, the independent state of Czechoslovakia was proclaimed in Prague. The crowds that filled the streets celebrated the end of 3 centuries of Habsburg rule and the birth of a new nation. The Kingdom of Bohemia, which had existed in one form or another for over 800 years, came to an end. Bohemia became part of the new Czechoslovak state, along with Moravia, Silesia, Slovakia, and Subcarpathian Ruthenia. The Bohemian crown, which had been worn by Přemyslids, Luxembourgs, Jagiellons and Habsburgs, was consigned to history. Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk became the first president of Czechoslovakia, a position he would hold until 1935. He worked to build a democratic state based on the principles he had advocated throughout his career. Czechoslovakia became one of the most successful of the new states created after the First World War, with a functioning democracy, a strong economy, and a vibrant cultural life. But the new state also inherited the ethnic tensions that had troubled Bohemia for generations. The German-speaking population of Bohemia, now a minority in a Czech-dominated state, felt marginalized and resentful. They had not been consulted about the creation of Czechoslovakia and did not welcome their incorporation into it. This German minority, concentrated in the border regions known as the Sudetenland, would become a source of instability in the years ahead. The interwar period saw Czechoslovakia flourish despite the challenges it faced. Prague became a centre of avant-garde culture, with innovative movements in art, architecture, literature, and film. Czech industry continued to develop, making Czechoslovakia one of the most economically advanced countries in Central Europe. The democratic system, though imperfect, functioned better than in most of the new states of the region. But the shadows were gathering. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany posed an existential threat to Czechoslovakia. Hitler made the grievances of the Sudeten Germans a centerpiece of his foreign policy, demanding that the Sudetenland be transferred to Germany. The Czechoslovak government resisted, but it could not stand alone against Nazi Germany. The crisis came to a head in September 1938. Hitler threatened war if his demands were not met. The British and French governments, desperate to avoid another war, pressured Czechoslovakia to give in. At the Munich conference, Britain, France, Germany and Italy agreed to the transfer of the Sudetenland to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not even invited to the conference that decided its fate. The Munich Agreement was a catastrophe for Czechoslovakia. The country lost its border fortifications, a significant portion of its population, and much of its industrial capacity. President Beneš, who had succeeded Masaryk, resigned and went into exile. The truncated state that remained was weak and vulnerable. In March 1939, Hitler completed the destruction of Czechoslovakia. German troops occupied the Czech lands, which were transformed into the protectorates of Bohemia and Moravia under German control. Slovakia became a nominally independent state, allied with Germany. Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. The years of German occupation were a time of suffering and resistance. The Nazi regime imposed a brutal system of control, suppressing Czech culture, exploiting Czech labour, and persecuting Jews and other targeted groups. The Jewish community of Bohemia, which had contributed so much to the region's cultural and economic life, was almost entirely destroyed in the Holocaust. Czech resistance took various forms. Some joined underground networks that gathered intelligence, sabotaged German operations, and maintained contact with the government in exile. The most dramatic act of resistance was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi governor of the Protectorate, by Czechoslovak agents in May 1942. The German reprisals were savage, including the complete destruction of the village of Lidice and the murder of its inhabitants. The Second World War ended with the liberation of Czechoslovakia by Soviet and American forces in May 1945. The country was restored to its pre-Munich borders, minus Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which was annexed by the Soviet Union. The German population of the Sudetenland was expelled, ending centuries of German presence in Bohemia. This expulsion, which affected some 3 million people, was accompanied by violence and suffering, a tragic coda to the long history of Czech-German relations. Czechoslovakia was re-established as a democratic state, but its independence was short-lived. In February 1948, the Communist Party seized power in a coup, transforming Czechoslovakia into a Soviet satellite state. For the next 4 decades, Bohemia was part of a communist dictatorship, its economy centralized, its politics controlled, and its connections to the West severed. The communist period brought industrialization and social change, but also repression and stagnation. The Prague Spring of 1968, an attempt to create socialism with a human face, was crushed by a Soviet-led invasion. The following 2 decades, known as the period of normalization, were marked by political conformity and cultural sterility. The end of communist rule came suddenly in November 1989. The Velvet Revolution, a peaceful uprising led by students, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, brought down the communist government in a matter of weeks. Václav Havel, a playwright and dissident who had been imprisoned for his opposition to the regime, became president of a free Czechoslovakia. But the newly free country soon faced another challenge. Slovak demands for greater autonomy and eventually independence led to the peaceful dissolution of Czechoslovakia on January 1st, 1993. The Czech Republic and Slovakia became separate states, ending the union that had been created in 1918. The Czech Republic, which includes Bohemia, Moravia, and Czech Silesia, has since developed as a democratic, market-oriented state. It joined NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004, integrating itself into the Western institutions that had been denied to it during the communist period. Prague has become one of the most visited cities in Europe, its beauty and history attracting millions of tourists each year. The Kingdom of Bohemia no longer exists as a political entity, but its legacy lives on. The Czech people trace their identity back to the medieval kingdom, to the Přemyslid dukes and kings, to the Hussite warriors, to the scholars and artists who kept Czech culture alive through centuries of foreign domination. The history of Bohemia is their history, a source of pride and identity. The physical legacy of the kingdom is visible throughout the Czech Republic. Prague Castle, which has overlooked the city for over 1,000 years, still serves as the seat of the Czech president. St. Vitus Cathedral, begun under Charles IV, still dominates the Prague skyline. The Charles Bridge still carries pedestrians across the Vltava. The medieval towns and castles that dot the Bohemian landscape still testify to the kingdom's long history. The cultural legacy is equally rich. Czech music, from the folk songs collected during the National Revival to the symphonies of Dvořák and the operas of Smetana, draws on traditions that developed over centuries. Czech literature, from the chronicles of the medieval period to the novels of the 20th century, reflects the experiences and aspirations of the Czech people. Czech glass, Czech beer, Czech craftsmanship of all kinds continue traditions that stretch back to the days of the kingdom. The religious legacy is complex. Bohemia was the birthplace of the first major challenge to the medieval Catholic Church, a century before Luther. The Hussite tradition of religious dissent and moral seriousness left a lasting mark on Czech culture, even as the Counter-Reformation restored Catholic dominance. Today, the Czech Republic is one of the most secular countries in Europe, but the echoes of its religious history can still be heard. The political legacy is perhaps the most important of all. The Kingdom of Bohemia, at its best, represented ideals of justice, learning, and national dignity. The reign of Charles IV showed what enlightened rule could achieve. The Hussite movement demonstrated that ordinary people could stand up for their beliefs against overwhelming power. The national revival proved that a suppressed culture could be brought back to life through dedication and effort. These legacies inspire Czechs today as they navigate the challenges of the 21st century. The history of Bohemia teaches that small nations can make great contributions to civilization. It teaches that freedom must be defended, sometimes at great cost. It teaches that culture and identity can survive even the darkest periods of oppression. The story of the Kingdom of Bohemia is a story of resilience. From the legendary arrival of the forefather Czech to the proclamation of Czechoslovak independence in 1918, the Czech people faced invasion, occupation, religious persecution, and political subjugation. They lost their independence at White Mountain and did not fully regain it for 3 centuries. Yet they survived, preserving their language, their culture, and their sense of themselves as a distinct nation.